Mount Hood National Forest had always been a refuge for me, far enough from Portland to feel remote, yet familiar enough to navigate without stress. John and I had explored these woods dozens of times before, each trip an exercise in pushing deeper into the unknown. But this weekend was supposed to be different. We'd decided to venture off-grid, away from busy trails and crowded campgrounds, into territory untouched since the logging boom died out in the early 80s. Early October sunlight filtered through a thin mist as we left Portland. The old Tacoma packed with enough gear for several days of mushroom foraging and wilderness photography. We skirted around the shores of Timothy Lake, aiming northeast. John had marked a vague location on our topo map, a spot neither of us had explored. The deeper into the forest we drove, the narrower the road became, until pavement turned to gravel, and gravel faded into soft dirt. It was John who noticed the gate first, partially obscured by dense alder branches and rusted almost beyond recognition. It stood slightly ajar, left that way years ago, judging by the saplings growing between the bars. The logging road behind it was barely visible beneath the growth, nature aggressively reclaiming the path humans had abandoned. "Let's check it out," John said. "I bet no one's camped back here in decades." The road was rough. Branches clawed at our windows, screeching faintly against the paint. We crawled along, the truck jolting over potholes and fallen branches. After nearly an hour, the road widened slightly into a clearing ringed with towering Douglas firs. It was eerily silent, devoid even of birdsong. John cut the engine, and the sudden absence of noise was almost unsettling. We set up our tent quickly, keen to use the daylight left for mushroom hunting. But as I unpacked gear, I felt oddly watched. It wasn't anything tangible, no sounds, no clear movements, just an uneasy sensation at the back of my neck. I shook it off as wilderness paranoia and joined John, hiking downhill toward a dry creek bed, eyes scanning for chanterelles and morels. The afternoon passed uneventfully until John suddenly stopped ahead of me, staring at something in confusion. I stepped up beside him and immediately understood why. There, wedged against a massive tree trunk 10 feet off the ground, were two large limbs arranged in an inverted V. Each limb was thick, at least 5 inches in diameter, and meticulously placed. They formed a shape too precise to be random. "Hunter's blind, maybe," I suggested, though neither of us was convinced. John shrugged, snapping a photo with his phone. "Weird place to put one." We picked our way back to camp as dusk crept into the woods. The silence had grown more pronounced. Usually evenings in the forest were filled with distant bird calls and insect hums. Tonight it felt as if the world around us had been muted. Around midnight, as we sat beside the small campfire nursing whiskey from a flask, the quiet shattered. A single deep thud echoed through the trees, distant but heavy enough to vibrate gently in my chest. John froze mid-sentence, eyes wide. I strained to hear more, but the forest had fallen silent again. "Tree falling?" John whispered hopefully. "Maybe," I murmured, unconvinced. A tree falling was messy, branches snapping, the crash prolonged. This had sounded deliberate, singular. Sleep was difficult after that. I lay awake, ears alert, my heartbeat exaggerated by the thick silence. Eventually, exhaustion took hold. It was some time later, drifting between consciousness and dreams, that I first heard the howls. At first, they were distant, low, almost mournful. But soon they rose, deepening into guttural calls, resonating through the forest like a chorus of unknown creatures. They sounded nothing like wolves or coyotes. Each howl seemed to linger, echoing endlessly through the dense trees around us. John's voice came from across the tent, barely audible over the howls. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered back, not trusting my voice. My heart hammered, pulse quickening as adrenaline seeped into my veins. Neither of us slept again that night. We stayed awake, listening until dawn painted the nylon walls of our tent a dim orange. When we finally emerged, bleary-eyed and exhausted, nothing around us appeared disturbed. But deep down, I knew something had changed. This wasn't the comforting Mount Hood wilderness we'd known for years. Something else claimed this forgotten road. something that wasn't welcoming our presence. My heart sank as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, bleary-eyed and anxious. The campsite felt unfamiliar now, as if we'd overstayed our welcome. John followed silently behind me, his movements stiff and wary. Both of us carried the shadow of last night's strange, unnerving howls. I tried shaking off the anxiety, convincing myself it was nothing more than overactive imagination. Then I noticed it. My backpack wasn't where I'd left it, propped carefully beside the tent. Instead, a shadow shifted across the ground near my feet. Slowly, my eyes traced upward, and a sickening realization settled in. My pack dangled at least 20 feet above us, suspended from a high branch of a towering Douglas fir. "What the?" John's voice trailed off, thick with disbelief. "Did you move that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No," he breathed quietly, staring upward. "Why would I?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. The pack hung motionless, swaying gently. From here, I could see a tear along the strap, as though something had ripped at it. But the food, sealed tightly inside, was untouched. No bear would have left our food intact, and no prankster could reach that height without climbing gear. The thought of someone, or something, lingering near our tent while we'd been asleep was chilling. John finally broke the silence, determined to keep calm. "Maybe it was a raccoon or something. You know they're smarter than they look." "Sure," I replied, unconvinced, my voice barely above a whisper. We retrieved my pack after some effort, using a rope and a long stick John had found. Its contents were exactly as I'd left them. We tried to busy ourselves, breaking camp slowly, as though routine tasks could erase the discomfort lingering beneath our skin. John seemed determined to push through, proposing we stay another night. I wanted desperately to refuse, but the thought of navigating the logging road in fading daylight wasn't appealing either. Eventually, we set off toward the creek again, hoping the mundane task of gathering water might ease our nerves. The forest felt oppressive now, the silence deafening rather than peaceful. Shadows twisted strangely. Branches seemed poised to reach out, snagging clothing and scratching bare skin. We reached the creek bed after a tense, silent hike. As John knelt to fill our bottles, my eyes wandered upward, scanning the ridge across the dry creek bed. That's when I saw it, a black figure, massive and upright, standing motionless among the trees. My breath caught sharply, adrenaline flooding my veins. "John!" I hissed urgently. He looked up, eyes following mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then the figure slowly crouched, disappearing behind thick foliage with unsettling fluidity. It had been tall, too tall to mistake for an animal or a hiker. Its shape had been strangely human, yet grotesquely oversized. "Did you see that?" My voice was shaking now. "Yeah," John replied quietly. His face was pale, eyes locked on the spot where the figure had vanished. "We need to get out of here, now." We practically sprinted back to the campsite, panic driving every step. As daylight faded, John built the fire higher than usual, piling dry logs until the flames crackled fiercely, casting an orange glow that pushed weakly against the encroaching darkness. Neither of us spoke much. Our voices felt intrusive in the unnatural stillness. Hours passed slowly. Just as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, a sound snapped me awake, a rhythmic, deliberate pacing around the perimeter of the clearing. Something large moved beyond the fire's glow, footsteps heavy, yet disturbingly precise. My muscles locked, every nerve alert. John's knuckles whitened around the handle of his hatchet. Another sound followed, the dull thud of a stone landing just inside our firelight, tumbling across the earth and stopping a few feet from my boots. I stared down at it, my blood running cold. Whatever was out there was strong and deliberate enough to hurl a rock silently, precisely. "Should we fire a flare?" John asked, his voice strained. I shook my head slowly. "We'll need them for tomorrow." The pacing eventually stopped, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. Minutes stretched endlessly into hours, and I couldn't shake the sensation that whatever it was hadn't left. I pictured it out there, watching, waiting with unnatural patience. Just before dawn, as the first pale hints of sunlight spilled through the trees, I clicked on my flashlight. Its beam sliced through the darkness, landing on something in the mud just beyond our truck. A footprint, massive, distinctly shaped, with long toes pressed deeply into soft earth. It was fresh. I stared at John, seeing my own fear mirrored in his wide eyes. Whatever was stalking us had been here moments ago, and it was far larger than either of us had imagined. Sunrise had barely breached the horizon when we began breaking down camp. Neither John nor I spoke much. Words felt meaningless after the night we'd endured. The massive footprint by the truck had shattered any illusion of safety we'd clung to. Something enormous, something beyond explanation, was lurking out here. Every shadow, every rustle, now carried the threat of the unknown. We packed hastily, throwing gear haphazardly into the back of John's Tacoma. I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see that black shape from yesterday again, massive and still, just watching. John fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly as he started the engine. It coughed to life, and for a fleeting second, I allowed relief to creep into my bones. But as we rolled onto the overgrown logging road, unease surged again. The path felt narrower, more twisted than it had on the way in. The dense forest pressed in from either side, scraping against the truck's paint. The Tacoma rocked unsteadily over potholes and fallen branches. I could feel the tension radiating off John. It mirrored my own. After 15 tense minutes, John's voice broke the silence, sharp with alarm. "It's following us." I spun around in my seat, staring into the mirror. For a terrifying instant, I saw it. A shadowy figure, massive and upright, moving steadily among the trees, effortlessly matching our speed. It wasn't charging, wasn't running, just moving forward with a steady, relentless pace. "Drive faster," I whispered hoarsely. The Tacoma lurched forward, suspension groaning as John navigated increasingly rough terrain. The narrow trail forced us to slow repeatedly, each delay ratcheting my anxiety higher. I felt trapped, utterly exposed on this isolated track. Then John slammed on the brakes. My body jerked forward painfully against the seatbelt. Ahead, a washed-out section of road stretched ominously across our path, a slick, muddy trench that looked almost impassable. John hesitated only a second before hitting the accelerator. The Tacoma surged forward, tires spinning wildly, fighting for traction in the muck. We slid sideways, mud spraying up against the windows, the engine roaring defiantly. "Come on," John shouted desperately, steering frantically to regain control. We made it through, barely. As we cleared the washout, John glanced over his shoulder again, and froze. I turned, following his gaze, my blood turning to ice. The creature stood motionless in the center of the road behind us, clearly visible in the daylight. Easily 8 feet tall, it loomed massive and powerful, its body covered in dark, leathery skin that rippled across thick muscle. Its stance was hunched slightly, arms long, fingers curled at its sides. The face, it was nearly human yet wrong, distorted by a brutish heaviness, mouth partly open, revealing sharp teeth. Eyes deep-set, black, expressionless. Suddenly, it lunged forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. John screamed something unintelligible, hammering his foot to the floor. The Tacoma roared in protest as we accelerated recklessly down the logging road, branches snapping violently against our windshield. I braced myself, heart pounding wildly as adrenaline surged through me. Behind us, the figure disappeared again into the dense foliage, but I felt no relief, only dread. Every second until we broke from this oppressive forest felt agonizingly slow. Finally, ahead, the gate came into view, rusted, crooked, and open exactly as we'd left it. We burst through it, skidding onto the wider gravel road, sunlight spilling brightly around us. John didn't slow, tearing down the gravel at reckless speed until the road widened further, eventually bringing us onto smooth pavement. Only then did he ease off the gas, knuckles white against the wheel. Neither of us spoke until we reached the zigzag ranger station. The world seemed unreal now, the mundane bustle of hikers and campers a surreal contrast to the nightmare we'd escaped. As we entered the ranger station, the Forest Service officer behind the desk glanced up, immediately sensing our distress. John spilled everything in a rush. Our remote camp, the bizarre structures, the footprints, the stalking presence. I expected skepticism, disbelief, dismissal. But the ranger listened carefully, quietly, nodding along. When John finished, he leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "You're not the first to come back rattled from that ridge," he said slowly, voice low and calm. He stood, opening a drawer and pulling out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward us. Inside were blurry photographs, trail cam stills of something huge moving among trees, indistinct but unmistakable. Beneath those were incident reports, encounters dating back decades, none publicly disclosed. "That logging road's been closed since '83. We stopped going up there," he explained, voice steady yet wary. "The forest has its own ways up there, things we don't talk about." As John and I exchanged silent, haunted glances, the ranger cleared his throat, eyes intense. "When you tell people about this, and I know you will, don't say it's Bigfoot," he said quietly, glancing toward the file. "Just remind them there are still parts of the forest that don't belong to us, places that never did." We walked out into the sunlight, leaving the ranger station behind, knowing we'd never venture down a forgotten road again. They call this place the Big Thicket. It's a name that feels both grand and understated. For outsiders, it's a spot on a map of southeast Texas, a green smudge known for its swampy reputation, and a few local legends about a wild man of the woods. They have names for him, of course. Mossyback, the Saratoga Wild Man. Campfire stories meant to spook kids and sell t-shirts in the dusty gas stations on the edge of the preserve. For the handful of us who work it, who walk its trails and wade its sloughs every day, those stories are just background noise, like the whine of the mosquitoes. The real dangers are the ones you can see. Cottonmouths coiled on a low-hanging branch, a flash flood turning a dry creek bed into a torrent, or a tourist who thinks a bottle of water is enough for a 6-hour hike in August. I'm Alistair Boone. For 25 years, my office has been this labyrinth of pine, cypress, and blackwater. At 58, I can read the land like most people read the morning paper. I know the sour smell of a storm rolling in off the Gulf, the specific rustle in the undergrowth that means feral hog instead of white-tailed deer, and the precise look in a young ranger's eyes when they're about to ask me a question I've answered 100 times before. "Hey, Al." I stopped, turning to look at Ben Carter. He was a good kid, barely 25, full of an earnest energy that hadn't yet been baked out of him by the Texas sun. He gestured with his chin toward a dark patch of woods off the trail. "You ever listen to that podcast, American Wild?" he asked. "They did an episode last week, The Thicket Wild Man. Said a couple claimed they saw him cross the road just north of here, over by the Saratoga Lights." I took a long swallow from my canteen before answering. "Ben, the Saratoga Lights are swamp gas and the distant headlights from Highway 105, and every sighting of that thing has two common ingredients: cheap beer and a story that gets better with every telling. The real monsters out here are the two-legged kind, the ones cooking meth in a clearing or poaching gators. Don't waste your energy on fairy tales." He nodded, though a little of the eager light went out of his eyes. I didn't mean to be hard on him, but the thicket demanded a certain pragmatism. Daydreaming could get you bit, or worse, lost. The call came an hour later, crackling over the radio as we were heading back to the station. A missing hiker, a UT Austin kid named Leo Jimenez. His rental sedan had been sitting at the Turkey Creek trailhead for 2 days. Turkey Creek is one of the bigger units, a sprawling boggy wilderness that can swallow a person whole if they're not careful. We found the car easily enough, locked. I peered through the window, my breath fogging the glass. On the passenger seat, plain as day, was a leather wallet and a smartphone. A cold knot tightened in my gut. No hiker, no matter how experienced, leaves their wallet and phone behind. It felt wrong. We pushed into the woods. His tent was a 1/4 mile in, a small dome of blue nylon tucked neatly under a stand of loblolly pines, but his gear was scattered in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. A pair of expensive binoculars sat on a stump, dewy in the morning air. Next to them, a camera with a telephoto lens that probably cost more than my truck. Leo was listed as an avid birder. A birder would sooner leave his own leg behind than his optics. We followed the main trail deeper, the air growing thick and humid. About a mile in, we stopped dead. The trail was gone. In its place were two enormous water oak trees, one laid over the other in a near-perfect X. They were fresh falls, the splintered ends of the trunks still pale and wet. "Microburst must have hit here," Ben said, his voice a little shaky from the effort it was going to take to clear it. I walked the length of the trunks, my boots sinking into the soft earth. I ran my hand over the brakes. No burn marks from a lightning strike, no clean cuts from a saw, just raw, splintered wood. It was strange, the symmetry of it, but I nodded. "Yeah, microburst. Let's get the saw." It was the only explanation that made sense. It took us most of the afternoon to clear the path, our sweat drawing clouds of biting flies. We found nothing else, just a single hiking sock, caught on the cypress knee of a nearby slough. Its bright orange a jarring slash of color in the endless green and brown. We called it a day as the sun began to cast long shadows through the trees. But I couldn't sleep that night. The image of those binoculars sitting on the stump, the wallet on the car seat, the perfect cross of the trees. It was a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. Before the sun was even up, I'd filled a thermos with black coffee, loaded my ATV onto the trailer, and driven back to Turkey Creek alone. A nagging instinct I'd learned long ago not to ignore was pulling me back. I left the truck and rode the ATV down the now cleared trail, the cool morning air a welcome relief. As I pushed deeper, a change in the atmosphere became apparent. It was a creeping stillness, the usual morning chorus, the chirps of the warblers, the incessant drone of cicadas warming up for the day, the croak of bullfrogs from the bayou, was gone. There was only silence, a thick, heavy blanket of quiet that felt profound, absolute, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. I've been in the thicket during freezes and floods, but I had never experienced a silence this complete. It was the sound of a world holding its breath. I strained my ears, hearing nothing but the low hum of my ATV's engine and the rushing of blood in my own ears. I rounded a bend in the trail, the same bend where we had spent hours with the chainsaw yesterday, and I slammed on the brakes. My heart hammered against my ribs. The thermos slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floorboard. The path was blocked. Two massive trees, freshly fallen, lay across the trail. They were laid one over the other in a perfect, deliberate, impossible X. For a long moment I just sat there on the ATV, its engine silent, the only sound the frantic thumping of my own heart. The second X formation was a declaration. My rational mind, the one honed by 25 years of explaining away shadows, was scrabbling for purchase and finding none. This wasn't a freak weather event. This was a barrier, a warning. Anger, hot and sharp, cut through the initial shock. This was my preserve. I wouldn't be chased out by some elaborate, malicious prank. I jammed the ATV into gear and wrenched the handlebars, veering off the trail and into the dense tangle of yaupon and sweet gum. If someone wanted to play games, I'd play. I pushed deeper, following a barely there game trail, the engine whining in protest as it churned through the damp soil. I was heading into a section of the Turkey Creek unit that was more swamp than solid ground, a place where the water, stained black by tannins, never fully receded. Then the engine sputtered. It coughed once, a puff of acrid black smoke, and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key. The ignition just clicked, a feeble, hopeless sound in the immense quiet. I was a decent field mechanic. It was a requirement of the job. I swung my leg off the seat and unlatched the engine cover. The smell hit me first, the rank odor of stagnant bog water and decay. The entire engine block was caked in it. Thick, black, viscous mud had been packed into every crevice, shoved around the spark plug wires, and smeared over the air intake. And there, pressed into the grime on the engine housing, was a handprint. I stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The print was massive, the palm wider than a dinner plate. The 5 fingers were long and thick, and the thumb was set low and wide, almost like a second opposable digit. It was not the print of a man. It was not the print of any known animal. It was a clear, deliberate act of sabotage, performed by something with impossible strength and biology. I was stranded. As that realization settled, I noticed the light was failing. The sun had dipped below the tops of the cypress trees, and the forest was sinking into a deep, gloomy twilight. The silence I'd felt earlier returned, but now it had a weight to it. Then came a sound from the tree line to my right. A sharp crack, like a Louisville slugger striking an oak tree. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the service pistol holstered at my hip. I unclipped the strap. My flashlight beam cut a nervous, trembling path through the dense undergrowth, illuminating nothing but dripping leaves and twisted vines. Crack. This one was behind me, louder, closer. I was being circled. Then a new sensation began. A low-frequency hum that seemed to generate not in the air, but in the ground beneath my feet. It vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a deep, resonant thrum that made my teeth ache and the fluid in my inner ears feel like it was buzzing. It was disorienting, nauseating. The hum grew in intensity, a constant, oppressive pressure, punctuated by the steady, circling reports of snapping wood. I abandoned the ATV. There was no thought, only a primal command from the oldest part of my brain. Run. I plunged into the woods, away from the sounds, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. I ran with the desperate, clumsy energy of prey, my decades of experience dissolving into sheer panic. My plan was to make it to a deer trail I knew was a half-mile north, a path that would lead back toward the main park road. The hum followed, a constant vibration in my bones. I could hear movement in the brush, paralleling my own, heavy bipedal footfalls squelching in the mud. It wasn't rushing, it was keeping pace, staying just at the edge of my vision. I crashed through a thicket of palmettos and saw the deer trail ahead. Relief surged through me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. And then I saw the log. A massive, waterlogged cypress trunk lay directly across the path. It hadn't been there a week ago. The ground around it was freshly disturbed, the mud churned. It was too large to climb, too long to go around quickly. My escape route had been cut off. It was hurting me. I ducked behind a massive cypress knee, trying to control my breathing, which was coming in ragged, painful gasps. I switched off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute. The hum continued, a constant, maddening thrum. Then I heard a sound that chilled me more than any roar could have. It was the call of a barred owl, a familiar 3-note hoot I'd known my whole life. But it was wrong. It was too deep, too guttural, and it carried an odd, resonant quality, as if it were being produced in a chest cavity far too large for any bird. It was a mimicry. It was telling me it knew the sounds of this place, and that it owned them. I had to move. I slid down the muddy bank into the black, chest-deep water of a bayou, the cold a violent shock to my system. The hum vibrated through the water, surrounding me. I pushed off, swimming through the clutching weeds toward the far bank. Halfway across, I risked a glance back. For a single, horrifying second, I saw it. On the bank I had just left, a silhouette stood against the slightly less black background of the sky. It was colossal, its shoulders immensely broad. It was standing on 2 legs, perfectly still, watching me. It wasn't charging. It wasn't threatening. It was just observing. Its sheer size was an offense to the natural order. It was a column of blackness, a hole in the shape of a man carved out of the night. I scrambled up the opposite bank, my clothes heavy with water and mud, and ran. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I was just running, pushed by a terror so profound it was a physical force. I burst through a final curtain of hanging Spanish moss and stumbled into a small, secluded clearing. My momentum died. I stood, panting, in the center of a nightmare. The ground was littered with objects, arranged in a way that suggested a collection. At the center of the clearing was a sort of den, a semi-enclosed structure woven from massive interlocking branches and river cane. I swept my failing flashlight beam across the ground. I saw Leo Jimenez's aluminum hiking pole. Next to it, half buried in the mud, was a plastic brick that I recognized as a 1980s-era Game Boy, its plastic gray and corroded. A few feet away lay a single child's cowboy boot, its leather cracked and faded. It was a lair, a midden heap, a trophy room. A heavy branch snapped at the edge of the clearing. I raised my light. It emerged from the trees. It was 8 feet tall, maybe more, and covered in thick matted hair that dripped with water and was laced with what looked like green moss. Its arms were long, its hands immense. But it was the face that locked the air in my lungs. The features were not ape-like. They were primitive, like a sketch of an early hominid from a textbook, and its deep-set eyes did not glow with animalistic rage. They were dark, intelligent, and they fixed on me with a look of calm, appraising authority. It was not a beast, it was a sentinel. This was its place. My arm came up, seemingly of its own volition. The pistol felt like a toy. I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, a flat, ugly bang that ripped through the clearing. The creature took a half-step back, its head tilting with what seemed more like curiosity than fear. That was all the time I had. I turned and ran, leaving the light of my flashlight and the last vestiges of my ordered, rational world behind in the mud of that terrible clearing. I don't know how long I ran. There was no thought, no direction, just the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the wet ground and the searing burn in my lungs. The forest was a black, clawing maze. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin. Cypress knees tripped me, but I never stopped. The hum was gone. The snapping branches had ceased, but the image of those dark, intelligent eyes was burned onto the back of my eyelids. The black of the sky eventually softened to a bruised purple, then a sick gray. Light filtered through the canopy, revealing the dripping, indifferent green of the world I had just survived. I stumbled through a final wall of vegetation and my feet hit something hard and flat, an old logging road overgrown with weeds. I took 2 more steps and collapsed, the world dissolving into a vortex of pain and exhaustion. I woke to the drumming of rain on a metal roof and the antiseptic smell of a hospital. Ben was sitting in a chair by the bed. He looked pale. He told me a search team had found me on the road, incoherent and suffering from severe exposure. He also told me a massive thunderstorm had rolled through right before dawn. My mind latched onto that, the rain. It would wash away my tracks, but it wouldn't wash away the ATV. It wouldn't wash away the lair. As soon as they released me, I let a team back in. Garrett, my supervisor, came along, his face a mask of professional concern. The air was cool and clean after the storm. The thicket looked freshly scrubbed. We found the ATV, its wheels sunk in fresh mud. I strode to it, my heart hammering, and threw open the engine cover. It was clean. The mud, the grime, the handprint, all gone. A few stray leaves were plastered to the metal, but otherwise, it looked as if it had simply stalled. Garrett glanced at me, one eyebrow slightly raised. "The rain must have washed it out, Al," he said, his voice gentle. Too gentle. "No," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "No, it was packed in there. It couldn't." I pushed on, leading them through the swamp to the place I was certain was the clearing. The ground squelched under our boots. We arrived at a small, unremarkable opening in the trees. It was empty. The ground was a mess of mud and flattened vegetation from the downpour. There was no woven den, no hiking pole, no child's boot, nothing. It was just another patch of empty woods. I walked in frantic circles, my hands shaking. It was here. The den was right here. His hiking pole. There were other things. Garrett put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Al, you went through a major ordeal. You were severely dehydrated. Your body temperature was dangerously low. It can make you see things." The debriefing was a quiet, humiliating affair in Garrett's sterile office. I laid it all out, my voice cracking with the effort of trying to make them believe. The X formations, the silence, the sabotage, the handprint, the chase, the lair. I showed them the deep scratches on my arms, the wild look in my eyes. My official report was typed up. Garrett read it, his expression unreadable. The official conclusion was that Senior Ranger Alistair Boone, under extreme physical and psychological distress during a high-stakes search, had experienced a prolonged and vivid hallucinatory episode. The missing hiker, Leo Jimenez, was presumed to have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. The search for his body would continue, but with no new leads. I was reprimanded for losing my service weapon, which was never found, for deviating from established search protocols, for filing a fantastical report that risked creating public panic. They put me on mandatory administrative leave, pending a full psychological evaluation. I never went back for the evaluation. I just filled out the paperwork for early retirement. 25 years of service, erased in a single night. That was 6 months ago. I don't go outside much anymore. My little house in Kunze has become a different kind of station. The living room walls are covered in maps. Topographical maps, satellite images, old survey charts from the county clerk's office. Red yarn connects a series of thumbtacks, forming a jagged, unofficial boundary deep inside the Turkey Creek unit. My days are spent in archives and online databases. I have compiled every missing persons report filed in or near the Big Thicket for the last 70 years. There are 12 of them, including Leo Jimenez, a family of 3 whose car was found abandoned in 75, a lone duck hunter in 88, a young couple in 96, all of them officially listed as victims of accident or misadventure. All of their last known positions fall within the boundary I have drawn on my wall. I stare at the map, at the web of red yarn. The horror is not in the memory of the creature. The true cold horror is in the conclusion my broken mind has finally reached. The washed-out footprints, the wiped-clean engine, the dismantled lair. It wasn't a panicked beast covering its tracks. It was a methodical erasure. It's not just one creature. It's a group, a clan, operating with a chilling generational intelligence. The tree formations weren't a threat. They were a filter, a way to test for persistence. The people weren't just killed. They were removed. They were witnesses who pushed too far, who saw something they shouldn't have, and who were efficiently and permanently silenced to protect a secret. The thicket isn't its territory. It is its fortress. And it is a fortress that has never been breached. I am a guardian of a truth that can never be told, a sentinel for a secret I can only watch from the outside, trapped in the crushing certainty that no one will ever, ever believe me. Cades Cove was always our go-to hunting ground, especially in November when muzzleloader season brought crisp mornings, fewer tourists, and plenty of whitetail. Sean, Marcus, and I had grown up around Maryville, Tennessee, hunting and camping together since our teenage years. We knew the Smokies like our own backyards, or at least we thought we did. Whenever we ventured deep, we always left a detailed trail plan behind, usually with my wife, Hannah. It gave us peace of mind, a ritual we never skipped. But on that cold morning in early November, even a perfect plan wouldn't be enough. We parked my truck near the trailhead off Rich Mountain Loop, grabbing our gear quickly. The forest was thick, the trees stripped bare, their skeletal branches clawing at a slate-gray sky. Marcus adjusted his hunting pack, flashing his familiar grin as we stepped off the pavement and into the leaf-littered silence of the woods. "Feel that?" Sean said, breathing deeply, frost forming around his lips. "That's freedom." Marcus laughed, slapping Sean on the shoulder. 2 nights away from civilization, finally. We planned to set camp a few miles beyond the usual hunting trails, following an old service road Marcus vaguely remembered from years past. The path quickly turned narrow, overgrown with briars and deadfall, but our confidence didn't waver. We pushed deeper until we found a small clearing near a dried-out creek bed. It was secluded enough, far off any marked trails, and perfect for our needs. By late afternoon, we had tents pitched and a fire crackling. We ate venison jerky and joked around as the daylight faded, our voices echoing off the trees. After sunset, the cold grew fierce, driving us into our sleeping bags earlier than usual. Lying awake, I listened to the forest settling, branches cracking and leaves rustling under nocturnal feet. But it felt familiar, comforting even. The next morning dawned clear but frigid. We split up to scout different ridges, planning to regroup around noon. Marcus took the northern ridge alone, following an animal path he'd spotted earlier. Sean and I moved south, communicating quietly over radios, spotting signs of deer but nothing worth chasing yet. When noon came and Marcus didn't check in, a tinge of worry crept into my mind. I called him over the radio. Static. Sean shrugged it off at first. Probably just stalking something big, you know how Marcus gets. But after another hour without contact, worry became dread. We circled back toward Marcus's intended route, shouting his name periodically, hoping to catch a response. Each silence stretched painfully between our calls. It was Sean who first pointed out the strange tracks. They were deep depressions in the earth, spaced impossibly far apart. He knelt down, examining one closely, his breath clouding visibly in the chill. "No claws, no paw pads," Sean muttered. "Doesn't look like bear." We continued along Marcus's path, my stomach tightening as we found more tracks, each print larger than a human foot, but narrower, elongated, pressed deep into the forest floor. No blood, no torn clothing, no evidence of struggle. Just those unsettling prints, marking a clear direction. By dusk, fear had replaced our confusion. We agreed not to split up again, building our fire high and bright, periodically firing our muzzle loaders into the night sky as distress signals for Marcus. Each report cracked sharply through the frozen air before being swallowed by the dark woods. Late into the night, Sean finally drifted into uneasy sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. The silence outside the fire's glow felt different now. Heavier, sharper, charged with menace. I strained my eyes toward the dark line of trees, imagining shapes forming between trunks. The shadows shifted unnaturally, pulling my focus again and again, until at last I saw something solid, unmoving, directly opposite our campsite. A silhouette stood motionless, framed by pale moonlight seeping through barren branches. It was tall, upright, clearly outlined as a figure staring right toward our camp. My throat went dry. Without blinking, I reached across the fire to shake Sean awake. By the time he jolted upright and grabbed his flashlight, the figure had disappeared, swallowed back into the darkness. Sean scanned the trees but found nothing. "I saw something," I whispered, heart hammering in my chest. "It was right there." Sean glanced around, cautious but skeptical. "You sure?" I nodded slowly, adrenaline still pulsing. I knew what I'd seen, but I couldn't name it. Not human, not animal. Neither of us slept again that night. We huddled close to the flames, staring warily into the darkness, listening to the silence of the forest, now a stranger to us. Marcus was still missing, and something was out there. Morning came slowly, as if the cold and tension had thickened the air itself. My fingers were stiff as I reloaded the muzzleloader and slipped extra rounds into my pocket, feeling the weight reassuringly settle. Sean was quiet, avoiding eye contact, busying himself packing supplies. Neither of us spoke about the figure I'd seen. The silence was enough. It said what neither of us could voice aloud. We retraced Marcus's route from the previous day, moving slowly through the brittle underbrush. Sean took the lead, scanning the ground carefully, checking for any missed signs. My breath hung in the air, a pale cloud swirling around my face as we pushed onward. Our radios crackled periodically with static bursts, taunting us with useless noise. We found nothing, no blood, no torn clothing, no struggle. Marcus had vanished cleanly, as if simply erased. A strange hopelessness began to settle over me, the kind that saps strength and dulls focus. I glanced at Sean, noticing his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. He was tired. I was too. Late in the afternoon, we reached a spot where a large oak stood alone near a narrow ravine. Something about it drew my attention, something off in its outline. I stepped closer and stared upward. There, embedded deep into the trunk, was a musket ball. It gleamed darkly, half buried, at least 9 feet from the ground. "Sean," I said, pointing upward, my voice wavering. Look! He stared silently, his eyes widening slowly. Marcus wouldn't shoot upward like that. No, I agreed, feeling nausea twist my stomach. Not unless he saw something. We stood beneath that tree, imagining Marcus aiming desperately upward, firing into something towering above him. I shivered, though not from cold. Sean broke our silence first, shaking his head abruptly. A bear climbing, he offered weakly, but his voice betrayed doubt. We moved onward, unwilling to dwell on impossible scenarios. As evening approached, the shadows grew darker, lengthening until they swallowed the ground entirely. Sean was jumpy, snapping his head around at every small rustle. I couldn't blame him. My pulse quickened at every snapping twig, every unexpected movement of leaves. We returned to camp in silence. A small meal of dried jerky and nuts was eaten hastily, each of us watching the darkness beyond the firelight. Afterward, Sean hesitated, his voice strained. "We leave at first light," he finally said, avoiding my gaze. "Whatever's happening here, Marcus, the tracks, I don't like it, we're getting out." I nodded quickly, eager to agree. Sleep felt impossible, yet exhaustion pulled heavily at my limbs. Eventually I lay down fully dressed, the loaded muzzle loader propped by my side, eyes fixated on the tent entrance. Hours passed, each one more oppressive than the last. At some point my eyes closed unwillingly, dragged down by fatigue. Dreams came and went, tangled and formless, until a sudden sharp noise jolted me awake. I bolted upright, heart racing, listening intently. Something was moving around the tent, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. "Sean?" I hissed, reaching out instinctively toward his sleeping bag. But my hand touched only empty fabric. Sean was gone. Panic surged through me. His boots lay beside mine, neatly placed. His rifle leaned untouched against the tent fabric. I grabbed my muzzle loader, my hands shaking, adrenaline clearing my mind instantly. Unzipping the tent flap with trembling fingers, I shone my flashlight into the night, its narrow beam sweeping erratically through the trees. "Sean?" I called louder, my voice cracking. Silence replied, mocking me. I stepped outside, my bare feet immediately numb against the frozen ground. The fire had dwindled to embers, faintly glowing red. Beyond the circle of dim light was nothing but darkness, deep and impenetrable. I felt impossibly exposed, utterly vulnerable standing there alone. A low rustle drew my attention sharply leftward. I raised the muzzle loader, the flashlight beam quivering as it searched the trees. My breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale misting thickly in the air. Another rustle, louder now, shifting just beyond visibility. "Sean?" I shouted again, desperation giving way to terror. Nothing replied. The woods were empty, mocking my panic. Then, movement. Quick, decisive, barely within the flashlight's reach. Tall and hunched, the figure slipped effortlessly between the trees. My heart nearly stopped. Whatever I was looking at was impossibly large, its stride exaggerated, silent. It moved away, deeper into the forest, swallowed swiftly by darkness. Fear took control. I staggered back into the tent, fingers numb, limbs weak, mind racing. I zipped it shut, pressing myself into the corner, gripping the gun until my knuckles ached. I barely breathed, listening intently for any noise, steps, breathing, movement, anything. But the night stayed quiet. Sean was gone, just like Marcus. I was utterly alone, trapped in a place I had once known, now terrifyingly unfamiliar. And somewhere in the blackness beyond the tent, I knew, something waited patiently. The faintest hint of dawn seeped through the tent walls, a pale gray glow that offered no comfort. I hadn't moved since retreating inside hours earlier, muscles cramped and aching, fingers wrapped tightly around the cold steel of my rifle. Sean was gone, Marcus was gone, and whatever had taken them was close, waiting somewhere in the trees outside. The silence that followed sunrise felt wrong, too heavy, unnatural. Slowly, painfully, I forced myself upright, pulling on boots without bothering to lace them properly. Grabbing only my weapon and flashlight, I stepped outside. The campsite was deserted, the remnants of our fire cold and lifeless. Sean's rifle leaned untouched against his pack, the silent evidence chilling me to my bones. My mind raced with frantic desperation. I was miles from the main trail, deep in territory that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. Without any better plan, I quickly stuffed a canteen into my jacket pocket and began to move, leaving everything else behind. I retraced the path we'd first taken, keeping my pace quick, eyes darting nervously between the trees. Within an hour, my panic grew unbearable. The landmarks that should have guided me were wrong. The fallen oak was missing, the bend in the creek misplaced. Trails I knew twisted into unfamiliar routes, looping me back toward the clearing again and again. My breaths grew shallow, each exhale ragged, clouds of vapor trailing behind me in the cold air. Then, slowly at first, but unmistakable, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, shadowing mine. Each step echoed from the trees around me, perfectly matching my pace. I froze, turning sharply, raising the rifle, finger trembling on the trigger. My voice barely escaped my dry throat. "Who's there?" Nothing moved. Silence surrounded me again, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something watched, patient and still, hidden among the thick branches and shadowy trunks. I pressed onward, breaking into a half-run, stumbling over roots, leaves crunching underfoot. The forest felt alive with movement, each step louder, my heartbeat pounding deafeningly in my ears. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a faint glimmer of daylight. Desperate hope surged in my chest. Breaking through the brush, I burst into a meadow, breathing hard, tears burning my eyes. Ahead lay the paved loop road of Cades Cove, miraculously familiar, untouched by whatever twisted nightmare I'd left behind. A distant rumble caught my attention. A park ranger's truck rounded the bend slowly, heading away. I sprinted forward, waving my arms wildly, shouting hoarsely for help. The brake lights flashed bright red. The truck slowed and reversed, gravel crunching reassuringly beneath its tires. The ranger, a young woman whose face was blurred through my tears, jumped out immediately. "Are you okay?" Her eyes widened as she saw me clearly. "What happened?" "Help!" I gasped. "Friends missing. Back there. Something took them." She ushered me inside the warm cab, handing me a radio. I gave details numbly. Our campsite, Marcus and Sean's disappearance, the tracks, but I didn't mention the figure directly, afraid of sounding insane. She nodded grimly and called it in, her tone careful and official, but I noticed the hesitation in her voice. Hours later, a search began. Dozens of rangers and volunteers combed the area for days, but no trace of Marcus or Sean was ever found. Eventually, a grim-faced ranger delivered the official news. The search was suspended due to incoming storms and dropping temperatures. No clues, no explanations. My friends were simply gone. Returning home felt hollow. I avoided mirrors, avoided sleep, avoided darkness. Weeks passed, but the nightmares remained vivid. Driven by lingering dread, I eventually returned to Cades Cove, hoping the familiarity might ease my memories. Instead, I found myself drawn toward Townsend, to a small, run-down cabin on the outskirts of town. An elderly man named Elias, his face weathered and lined, listened quietly as I recounted my experience. When I finished, he nodded slowly, eyes shadowed. "You ain't the first to see it," he murmured. "Them woods is old. Something's been there longer than us, longer even than the Cherokee. Folks call it the Stone Man. Walks upright, moves silent, hates fire and loud noises, but once it knows you're there, you ain't safe no more." He refused to elaborate further, waving me away as though afraid I'd brought the curse back with me. I left with more questions than answers, haunted by the truth of his words. 3 years passed. I quit hunting, moved away from Maryville, tried to forget. Then, one restless night, scrolling aimlessly online, my blood ran cold. A hiker had posted a trail cam image, grainy and poorly lit, taken near Rich Mountain, our exact campsite area. My throat tightened painfully as I stared. There it was, unmistakable. The figure stood tall, emaciated, limbs elongated and twisted, skin pale beneath coarse patches of dark hair. Its gaunt features were blurred, distorted by shadow, but what froze me in place was the object it gripped in one bony hand, the rusted, unmistakable barrel of a muzzle loader. The post disappeared by morning. The hiker's account was deleted, erased as quickly as it appeared, but the image remained burned into my memory, proof of something ancient and terrible that still stalked those woods. I never spoke of it again, knowing now that some places were never meant to be disturbed. They call it the Grizzly Lake Loop, a name that's both a promise and a warning. 53 miles of raw Northern California wilderness that chews up the unprepared and spits them back out if they're lucky. The Trinity Alps aren't like the Sierras, with their granite superhighways and well-beaten paths. The Trinities are a different beast, a chaotic jumble of crumbling peaks, dense forests, and trails that seem to vanish into thin air. People get lost here. Sometimes they're never found. I'm an ER nurse. I thrive on chaos, on bringing order to the brink of disaster. Maybe that's why I run. Out here, the chaos is different. It's pure, elemental, and for the past year, I've been preparing to tame it. To set a new fastest known time on the loop. Meticulous planning, grueling training runs, every piece of gear weighed and tested. This run isn't just about speed, it's about control. It's my answer to the relentless, messy reality of my job. I'm not just here to run the trail, I'm here to own it. The air at the Long Canyon trailhead had the cold, clean bite of 4 a.m. I pulled on my gloves, the fabric stiff in the chill, and clicked my headlamp on. Its beam cut a perfect, unwavering circle on the dusty ground. My pack felt like a part of me, its 2 liters of electrolyte mix sloshing softly. The 4 gels tucked into the front pocket a precise calculation of calories and caffeine. I hit the start button on my GPS watch. The screen glowed. 0 miles. Time to go. The first few miles were pure rhythm. The familiar, satisfying crunch of my shoes on the packed earth. The steady cadence of my own breathing. The trail climbed relentlessly, but my legs felt like pistons, strong and tireless. I focused on the numbers, the data points that defined success. Heart rate steady at 155, pace a solid minute ahead of my target. The forest was a black and white film reel in the cone of my headlamp, the trunks of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs flashing past. The only sound was the rush of the North Fork Trinity River, a constant roar from the canyon floor below. This was my element. This was control. As the sky began to bleed from inky black to a bruised purple, I switched off the headlamp. The world resolved itself into color and shape. The granite peaks to the east caught the first rays of sun, their jagged edges glowing a fierce, fiery orange. My confidence surged. I was flying. Around mile 10, cresting a ridge that dropped towards the dark, still water of Papoose Lake, it happened. It wasn't a sound, but the absence of it. One moment, the forest was alive with the morning chorus of Steller's jays and the buzz of insects. The next, it was gone. Total, absolute silence. Not peaceful, not serene. This was a heavy, suffocating silence, like the air being sucked out of a room. The hair on my arms stood up. I stopped, my hands on my knees, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the thudding of my own heart. Then, as slowly as it had vanished, the sound returned. A single chickadee called out, then another. The world exhaled. I shook my head, my breath misting in the air. A strange pocket of cold air, an inversion, something. I had a schedule to keep. I pushed on. The feeling started as I pushed deeper, into the basin that cradled the feet of Thompson Peak. This was the remote section, the part of the trail where seeing another human was a statistical improbability. It began as a prickle on the back of my neck, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I told myself it was a deer, a bear foraging for manzanita berries. But the feeling was different. It was the distinct, unnerving sensation of being paced. I ran, and it was there, a large presence moving parallel to my position, keeping my exact speed, just inside the dense, shadowy wall of the tree line. I stopped, and the feeling subsided. The forest was just a forest. I started running again, faster this time, and it was back instantly. The perfect synchronicity was what made it impossible. A bear would crash through the undergrowth. A deer would be long gone. This was silent. It made no sound, snapped no twigs, displaced no leaves. It was a ghost in the shape of something heavy. I fought down the surge of adrenaline, the primal instinct to bolt. Panic was inefficient. Panic wasted energy. I was an athlete. I was in control. I tried to reason it away. An auditory hallucination brought on by exertion, my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt too real. I decided to run a test. My map showed a steep, faint shortcut, a scree field that would cut a mile off a long switchback. It was a risk, but it would change the geometry of the situation. It would force whatever was out there to react. I veered off the trail, my shoes sliding on the loose rock. I scrambled upward, my fingers digging into the gritty slope. I was halfway up when a shadow fell over me. I looked up. A dark shape, the size of a microwave oven, detached itself from the stable slope above. It didn't roll or tumble in a spray of debris. It seemed to slide, a deliberate, silent release. It landed on the path I had been climbing towards with a flat, final crack that echoed off the granite walls. Dust plumed up. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked up at the slope where it had come from. The surrounding rocks were motionless. There was no trail of disturbed earth. It wasn't a natural rock slide. It was a warning. The shortcut was blocked. My test had been answered. And in that moment, all my confidence, all my meticulous planning, all my delusions of control unraveled into a single ice-cold certainty. I was being herded, and the hunt had just begun. The sun dipped below the western peaks, and the world lost its hard edges. The granite walls of the basin turned from gray to a deep, bruised purple. Shadows bled out from the tree line, swallowing the details of the forest and leaving only dark, impenetrable shapes. The FKT was a ghost, a foolish ambition from another lifetime. My new goal was measured in heartbeats. Get to the next bend, cross the next creek, survive. I had scrambled back down from the scree field, my hands shaking, and rejoined the trail. My pace was no longer efficient, it was frantic. I ran with my head on a swivel, my eyes darting into the darkening woods. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was a held breath. A pause. Then came the sound. A sharp, violent crack split the air, echoing from a cliff face high above me to my left. It wasn't a rockfall. It was a single, percussive impact, like a high-velocity rifle shot. I flinched, stumbling to a halt. I scanned the cliffs, but saw nothing. Seconds later, another crack, this time from the opposite side of the basin, farther away. My medical mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, made a connection that turned my blood to ice. The sounds were too clean, too deliberate. One point of impact, then another. A blind patient using a cane to navigate a hallway. A bat emitting clicks to map a cave. It was triangulation, echolocation, a way to pinpoint my exact location in the vast, darkening landscape. A sob of pure terror escaped my lips. This wasn't a mindless beast. It was a hunter, and it was using the mountains themselves as a weapon. The chase was on. I abandoned all thought of energy conservation and ran. My lungs burned, a raw, searing fire in my chest. Lactic acid flooded my quads and calves, a pain so intense it felt like the muscle was tearing from the bone. But the fear was a more potent fuel. It was a cold, clean fire pushing me onward. The rhythmic cracking followed me, a terrifying metronome for my flight. Crack from the ridge above. Crack from the valley floor below. It was always there, mapping my progress, a constant reminder that I was not escaping, I was only running. As twilight deepened, the trail led me onto a narrow, exposed ridge. The ground fell away steeply on both sides into black, bottomless space. I slowed, my balance precarious. It was here, with nowhere to go but forward or back, that I risked it. I glanced over my shoulder. Against the last faint glow of the western sky, A shape detached itself from the solid black of the tree line on the ridge I had just crossed. It was for less than a second, but the image was burned onto my retina. It was tall. It stood on two legs. The shoulders were a solid, impossibly broad block of darkness. It was not a bear. It was not a man. It was something other, something for which my mind had no category. I snapped my head forward. A strangled gasp caught in my throat. A trick of the light. Exhaustion. It had to be, but I couldn't erase the image. The cracking had stopped. I realized this with a new jolt of fear. Why? Had it lost me? Or was it close enough that it no longer needed to map my position from a distance? Ahead, the main trail switched back down the ridge. But I saw another option. A steep drainage filled with pines, a dark slash in the side of the mountain that, according to my mental map, would be a faster, more direct route out of this high basin. It was a gamble, but it was my only one. I broke from the trail, heading for the cover of the trees. I had taken no more than 5 steps when a sound from above made me freeze. It was a soft, sliding noise, followed by a clatter. A shower of small rocks and pebbles rained down the slope directly in front of me, peppering the ground at the entrance to the drainage. It wasn't a landslide. It was a gentle cascade. A curtain of falling stone just large enough to block my path. Just enough to be a message. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. The path was not my choice. My direction was not my own. It was not trying to kill me. Not yet. It was hurting me, keeping me on the trail it had selected. I was a creature in a maze and the walls were moving around me. The control I'd felt at dawn was a bitter joke. I was prey, and my hunter was patient, intelligent, and utterly, terrifyingly in charge. Darkness was no longer falling. It had fallen. The world was gone, replaced by the tight, bouncing tunnel of my headlamp beam. It was a pathetic spear of light against an ocean of black. My body was a machine shutting down. My quads seized with cramps that felt like knots of hot wire being twisted in my flesh. I stumbled, my ankle turning on a loose rock, and pitched forward, catching myself on my hands. The skin on my palms tore. I didn't feel it. I was beyond simple pain. Dehydration was a claw in my throat. My vision blurred at the edges, and strange, fleeting shapes danced in the periphery of my headlamp's glow. I knew they were hallucinations, my brain short-circuiting from exertion and fear, but the knowledge did nothing to lessen their terror. The cracking sounds had stopped hours ago. The silence that took their place was worse. It was an absolute void, a vacuum that pressed in on me. I kept waiting for the sound that would end it all, the whisper of movement behind me, the snap of a twig under a heavy foot. I was certain it was there, just beyond the light, pacing me in the final stage of its game, waiting for my system to fail completely. I don't know where the last surge of energy came from. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a primal, animal command from the deepest part of my brain. Move. My legs obeyed, wooden and clumsy. I ran, my gait a broken, lurching thing. I pushed through a final thicket of firs, branches whipping at my face, and then I fell out of the trees and onto a flat, wide surface of packed dirt and gravel. A fire road. The sight of it, a clear, straight line carved by humans, broke something inside me. The last wire holding my body together snapped. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the ground. A violent, full-body spasm seized me, and I retched, vomiting the acidic remains of water and electrolyte mix onto the dirt. I lay there, gasping, my cheek pressed against the cold ground, fully expecting a shadow to fall over me. This was it, the end of the chase. Instead, I heard an engine. A low rumble grew steadily louder. 2 points of light appeared down the road, cutting through the darkness. They resolved into the headlights of an old pickup truck. It slowed and stopped a few yards away, its engine idling. 2 doors opened and closed. 2 men walked into the beams of their own headlights. They were older, their faces deeply lined, wearing faded flannel and jeans. They didn't rush over. They moved with a slow, deliberate calm. "Easy there," one of them said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He wasn't speaking to me, but to the darkness behind me. They helped me to my feet. My legs wouldn't hold me. They half carried me to the truck and eased me into the passenger seat. One of them pulled a coarse wool blanket from behind the seat and wrapped it around my shoulders. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He looked at my eyes, and he knew. The driver got in, but before he closed the door, he picked up a powerful, heavy flashlight from the dashboard. He clicked it on and aimed its bright white beam directly at the tree line where I had emerged. The light swept back and forth across the impenetrable wall of black. "You're lucky," he said, his gaze still fixed on the trees. "Something's been clearing the game out of this basin for a month. We haven't seen a deer or a bear in weeks." He shut the door, and the truck lurched forward, its tires crunching on the gravel. As we drove away, I turned in my seat and looked back. For a single, heart-stopping second, I saw it. A shape detached itself from the absolute black of the forest edge. It was massive, its shoulders a solid broad silhouette against the lesser dark of the night sky. It stood motionless, watching us go. There was no sense of pursuit, no hint of frustrated anger. It was simply observing our departure, and in that moment, the final, most terrible truth settled into my bones. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't won. The chase was over because the hunter had ended it. For reasons I would never understand, I had been tested, examined, and then discarded. I was a quarry deemed unworthy, a thing no longer interesting. My survival wasn't my own victory, it was a whim. And that knowledge, the chilling realization that my life had been in the hands of something so powerful and had been spared out of simple indifference, was a horror that would follow me long after I left the silence of the Trinity Alps behind. I used to think my parents' place was the epitome of ordinary, cookie-cutter neighborhood at the base of some foothills, complete with a neat little fence and a paved driveway. But everything shifted once I found that obscure path just off the canyon road. It's hidden behind a thin screen of trees, and the sign is either so faded or small that most people wouldn't notice it even if they were looking. I stumbled across it thanks to a hunch and a friend's random tip. And on the day I decided to explore it with a buddy from the Lost Creek expeditions, well, that was the afternoon everything changed. We parked near the bend in the road and got out. The chill in the air smelled like wet earth and leaf rot, which made sense because the entire slope was drenched in melting snow. The moment we stepped onto the gravel, 2 sharp cracks echoed through the trunks. My friend froze, glancing at me with a "Did you do that?" expression. I shook my head. It was definitely coming from deeper in the trees, although the idea of random branches snapping on their own crossed my mind. I tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced. It was the first spark of suspicion that something, or someone, was aware we had arrived. The trail itself was a sloppy mess, coated with slush and fresh mud. Each step made an ugly squelching noise that shattered any semblance of silence. The canopy overhead was so thick, most of the day's light got swallowed before it touched the ground. It was like entering a tunnel of shadows. We picked our way along carefully, occasionally slipping. We only made it a few hundred feet when another pair of cracks rang out, sharper than the ones by the car. My friend threw me a nervous smile, and I tried to shrug like it was normal. On the inside, I was rattled. The knocks felt deliberate, spaced just right, almost like signals or warnings. We kept moving, telling each other we were just being paranoid. Sure, it's a remote trail. Sure, it looks spooky. Could be normal forest sounds, right? Except the deeper we went, the heavier the atmosphere became, like someone had draped a wet blanket over everything. My friend pointed out how odd it was that we hadn't seen a single squirrel, bird, or even a random chipmunk. By this point, I was seriously wondering if we'd wandered into a section of woods that didn't appreciate visitors. Eventually, we reached a point where the path leveled off, and we found a small clearing. It was probably the only spot along that stretch of trail where daylight actually made it through the branches. My friend wanted to stop for a snack, so we hunkered down on an old fallen log, only half focused on the granola bars in our hands. My ears kept straining to catch even the faintest noise. That's when a third set of knocks rattled the air from somewhere up the slope. I remember locking eyes with my friend. At that moment, there was no more kidding around. We knew we weren't imagining it. Despite the growing tension, we decided to wrap up the snack break and head back. Neither of us openly admitted being uneasy, but the walk down felt much faster than the hike up. When we finally made it to the car, the weird sense of relief washed over me so hard I actually paused to catch my breath. My friend and I swapped a few hushed theories, maybe a woodpecker, maybe trees shifting in the wind, but neither of us believed it. A knot of dread seemed lodged in my gut, insisting something else was going on. I ended up returning to that trail on my own not long after. It nagged at me constantly. I'd be sitting in the living room at my folks' place, looking out at the ridges, and I'd feel this pull to go back. Every trip was the same: slick ground, murky light, an uncanny hush. The knocks were still there too, echoing sporadically as if they were following my progress. My mom eventually tagged along on one of these outings, during a cold, overcast morning. We didn't talk much until we reached the top third of the path, where a chain of knocks surrounded us from every direction. She just raised her eyebrows, unsettled but pretending she was fine. Neither of us dared speak above a whisper. At first we told ourselves it was just the forest. After all, nature can get weird. But as we headed home, the silence in the car was suffocating. We both sensed that something far stranger than random tree sounds lived up there. Even recounting it now, the memory of those cracks in the distance makes my stomach twist. Yet, I couldn't stay away. Something about that trail demanded my return, like I'd stumbled onto a secret that refused to stay hidden. Even though the experience unsettled me, I needed to know more. I needed to find out what was knocking back. I didn't realize just how deep I'd gotten into this obsession until the day I ventured up there alone again. No casual friend in tow, no group, just me and the looming wall of silent trees. I wasn't stupid. I was nervous as hell, but the urge to see if the knocks would happen again, or if something even weirder might, had me lacing up my boots anyway. So I parked my car at the usual spot and started up the trail like I had a dozen times before. Barely 10 minutes in, I heard rustles in the brush, the kind you catch at the corner of your ear when something big is moving around. I kept telling myself it could be a deer, but a few minutes later, that notion collapsed when a resounding "woo" boomed from somewhere off to my right. I froze like I'd just been caught stealing. My heart stuttered, but after a couple of breathless seconds, I did something probably insane. I answered back with my own "woo." It was more out of adrenaline than courage, like my brain hadn't gotten the memo that this was a terrible idea. The response came so fast it nearly knocked me backward, a vicious, high-pitched screech that shot through the trees. My spine prickled. The sound wasn't human, yet something about it felt eerily intentional, like an angry command. I've been out in the woods enough to know the usual suspects: owls, foxes, hawks. This wasn't any of those. It was deeper, more layered. My whole body was shaking, but I forced myself to keep calm, crouching to make a smaller silhouette in case, God forbid, whatever was out there saw me as a threat. I guess I must have sat for a while, but I couldn't tell if it was 1 minute or 10, because the whole world got so quiet I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then this new noise drifted toward me, something soft at first, like a faint panting. But it grew louder, heavier, until it felt like the breathing of an animal with a chest the size of a refrigerator. Ha, ha ha ha, ha 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 ha. Each exhale sounded closer than the last, though I couldn't pinpoint from which direction. It was as though the forest itself was breathing, massive lungs expanding in the shadows around me. Terror lit up my nerves. My brain reeled with possibilities: bear, mountain lion, or something else entirely. But something about the pattern felt calculated, like it was announcing its presence rather than creeping up for a kill. Maybe it was trying to scare me away. If so, it worked. I stood carefully, heart hammering against my ribcage, and started moving back downhill, slow enough that I wouldn't trip on the muddy slope. The moment I decided to leave, that heavy breathing cut off like a switch had been flipped. Dead silence again. There's a twisted kind of relief in being left alone, but it sure didn't feel like a blessing. More like a threat that could fire up again any time. Another time, not long after that, I spotted an odd structure near the top of the trail, under a thick old tree that had been bent and broken, yet was somehow still clinging to life. Leaning against its trunk were several sticks, long, sturdy branches arranged in a triangular shape like a teepee. I'd read about weird stick structures in online stories, but always figured they were bushcraft shelters or kids playing around. This one, though, looked too deliberate. The sticks had been placed at angles that locked them together. No random pile of deadwood could pull that off. Against my better judgment, I whipped out my phone and snapped a few photos. My breath caught in my throat. There was an unmistakable pressure in the air, like I was being watched from just outside my field of vision. You know that feeling when the hairs on your neck stand up? Multiply that by 10. I hurried back down the trail faster than I should have, half slipping in the mud, convinced I might catch a glimpse of something darting through the trees. The next day, I must have been half out of my mind, because I went up again to see if any fresh clues were waiting. At first, it seemed normal, or as normal as that place can feel. But once I was near the base of the trail, I nearly puked when I saw it. A deer carcass, or what was left of it. The skull was mostly intact, still attached to part of the spine, but the legs looked snapped, twisted. No scattering of fur or signs of a typical animal kill either. It was like it had been dropped there, right where I couldn't miss it. A jolt of horror flooded my system so fast my knees almost buckled. I remember standing there, trying to wrap my head around it, when a single notion took hold. This was left for me, because of the pictures. That was the instant I decided never to bring a camera up there again. It felt like crossing a line, as if I'd disrespected something that didn't appreciate prying eyes. Word of my experiences must have gotten around, because a friend who was skeptical about the whole thing pestered me to let him tag along. We went at dusk, and the knock started up almost on cue. By the time we got halfway, a series of sharp clacks echoed so loudly, you'd swear someone was whacking a tree trunk right beside us. My friend's confidence evaporated. We walked out of there in a hurry, each step mirrored by faint crunches in the undergrowth. Neither of us dared look back. I made it a personal rule. No more cameras. No more inviting people to witness it, unless they're truly prepared. The idea that I was treading on sacred ground, someone else's territory, gnawed at me constantly. Every time I ventured back, I felt a swirl of excitement and dread. Something out there was watching, maybe testing me. And after that deer skeleton incident, I wasn't eager to push any further than I had to. I wish I could say I stayed away, but that would be a lie. It's like this place has a pulse of its own, and it's synced with my curiosity, dragging me back whenever I try to ignore it. At this point, I know it's only a matter of time before something big happens, something impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Yet part of me keeps coming back for more, in spite of the warning signs piling up like stacked bones. And that, I guess, is where caution ends and obsession begins. I don't know why I kept testing my luck on that trail, but I guess part of me needed closure. Something told me the story wasn't finished, so when I heard about the second structure, it was like an invisible force tugging me back. The first one, a teepee of sticks under that warped tree, was shocking enough, but my friend claimed to have spotted another, bigger construction further up, near a grove of aspens that had been bent almost into an arch. He was nervous about returning, so I decided to check it out alone. I still wonder if that was a huge mistake. Reaching the arch took longer than usual because the trail felt wetter than ever. Mud sucked at my boots with each step, like the land was trying to hold me back. When I finally got there, I noticed the arch wasn't just a random shape. Long branches had been wedged crosswise, forming a kind of lattice. Slabs of fresh aspen bark draped across the top like roofing tiles, channeling the rainwater so it ran off in neat rivulets. It definitely wasn't natural. My chest tightened at the idea of something with clever hands building that. The silence felt like it might smother me on the spot. Even though it scared me, I crouched down to look inside. It looked barely tall enough for a person on all fours. Maybe an adult could sit comfortably, but not stand. Either way, it was sturdy. As I stood to leave, I caught a whiff of something unfamiliar, earthy, kind of damp and animalistic. It was enough to make me back away, uneasy that whatever stayed in there might come home at any moment. On the return trip, I heard frantic wood knocks from above, almost like a warning or maybe a scolding for trespassing. That's when I glanced up the slope and spotted a silhouette. At first, I assumed it was just a broken trunk. The shape blended perfectly with the surrounding trees. Then it glided sideways behind a thicker trunk, with such effortless motion that my head spun. For several seconds I stood there, trying not to lose it. The presence of that shape, tall, quiet, and cunning, twisted my nerves into knots I still haven't worked out. I might have tried to rationalize it away, except there were other details I couldn't ignore. Foot-shaped impressions in the muck that vanished like someone had deliberately erased them. Shredded bark on wide trunks at heights no average animal would reach. One of the worst discoveries was a half-eaten rabbit's carcass, propped near the path where I couldn't miss it. I'd walked that spot earlier, and it definitely hadn't been there before. The notion that someone might be placing these gruesome finds on purpose made my skin crawl. Word about my experiences spread among friends, and soon I was getting messages from people who wanted proof. Pictures, hair samples, footprints, anything. I refused to bring a camera anymore, remembering the deer bones from my last attempt. I had zero desire to push this phenomenon any further than I already had. That trail still calls to me every time I pass by those mountain ridges. It's not peaceful, it's far from it. It feels like stepping onto ground that belongs to something else, something you sense just outside your vision. I keep telling folks that, no matter how curious they are, they should think twice before hunting for cryptic answers there. Curiosity might lead you straight to a truth you're not ready to handle, and once you've glimpsed that shape shifting behind the trees, or found those bones laid out for you, you can't pretend it was just your imagination. You carry it with you forever. I hopped off the train in Olympia feeling pretty confident that I could handle whatever lay ahead. Figured if I could manage the moody weather and notoriously fickle schedules of public transit, a few crashing waves in Westport would be no big deal. Truth be told, I'd been itching for something new, something unexpected. Surfing in the cold waters of coastal Washington sounded like the perfect fix. After a quick cup of cheap coffee, I stuck out my thumb along the highway, and an old truck eventually pulled over. The driver, a lean man in a flannel jacket, wasted no time telling me there wasn't much going on at the shore this time of year. I laughed it off, but he just shrugged and said some folks liked their solitude a little too much. The comment hung in the air, weirdly unsettling. Maybe he was just making conversation, but his words rattled around my head the rest of the ride. When we reached Westport, I thanked him and climbed out. The wind greeted me like a slap, sharp and relentless, carrying the tang of salt from the water. After I found a shop willing to rent me a surfboard for the day, I sprinted straight for the shore with more excitement than caution. That was my first mistake. The Pacific in May was nothing short of frigid, and the waves slammed me like I'd insulted them personally. Still, I stuck with it, if only out of stubbornness. By late afternoon, every inch of me was exhausted. My face stung from the wind, and my arms felt like heavy weights from paddling. The thought of a warm bed seemed like wishful thinking at that point. A local suggested heading south to Grayland State Park if I wanted an out-of-the-way place to crash, pay for a campground, or skip the fee by stealth camping if I was feeling bold. Naturally, bold won out. I hitched another short ride down Highway 105, noticing how the trees along the road grew thick and twisted, their branches leaning over the asphalt as though trying to keep secrets locked under their canopy. Not that they were towering giants, far from it, but they formed a continuous tangle that blocked out a good portion of the sky. Something about those woods made my mouth feel dry. even though I couldn't pin down why. Grayland turned out to be nearly deserted. One bulky RV stood near the entrance with its blinds closed, as if whoever was inside didn't want to see or be seen. A tent further down looked zipped up for the night, no sign of movement. The air there felt different, less briny, more earthy, like damp soil and leaves, with a sharp undertone of marine chill. I decided to scope out the trail leading to the beach. By then, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that danced along the edges of the trees. The wind pushed me forward, almost urging me to get on with it. I found a decent spot a short distance away from the surf, marked by a weirdly shaped rock and a flimsy post fluttering with a bit of pink ribbon. I dropped my gear, a battered sleeping bag, ground tarp, and the wetsuit I hadn't bothered returning yet, thinking it would be easy enough to find them later. Before dark truly set in, I headed to the bathroom hoping I could charge my phone. No dice. The overhead light flickered, but the outlets were dead. No caretaker or ranger in sight. I took a moment to rest against the concrete wall, listening to the wind whine through the empty campground. A tiny voice in my mind asked why nobody else was around. Sure, it was off-season, but it felt downright abandoned. I lit up a cheap cigar, watching the last rays of sunlight fade. My nerves buzzed with anticipation. Maybe from the lack of real food, maybe from that edgy stillness that only comes when a place feels untouched by casual human presence. Occasionally I heard the muffled sound of the waves crashing, and I pretended it was lulling me into a sense of calm, a weak illusion. Once darkness settled in, I realized I couldn't stall forever. I'd have to brave the narrow trail again, guided only by what little moonlight seeped through the canopy. My stomach twisted at the prospect of stumbling around blindly, but I tried to laugh it off. It's just a half-tamed strip of coastal forest, I told myself. What's the worst thing that can happen? With that, I pushed off the bathroom's damp concrete wall and started walking, the wind picking up as though it wanted me to hurry. Everything around me felt on edge, like the environment itself was waiting for me to make a wrong move. I had a flash of the driver's words from earlier. Some folks like their solitude a bit too much. The phrase made me glance over my shoulder, scanning the dimly lit campsite. I didn't spot a soul, but I still couldn't shake the nagging sense that something beyond my knowledge thrived in that emptiness. Determined to camp as planned, I took my first steps into the dark. Little did I know just how quickly my confidence would unravel once the trees swallowed me whole. The second I stepped beyond the tree line, the campground lights and that tiny thread of comfort they offered vanished behind me. It was as though I'd walked into a different reality, one where the wind seemed louder and the darkness felt tangible, like it had weight. I kept my hands stretched out in front of me, trying to avoid slamming into a trunk, but my breath still caught at every near miss. Each shuffle forward was a calculated gamble. The path underfoot was uneven, and I had zero sense of how far I'd come. Despite knowing I just had to continue west, I soon lost all sense of direction. In theory, if I kept moving, I'd stumble onto the shore eventually. Instead, I found myself trudging in circles, spooked by the sensation that the trees were closing in. My arms brushed rough bark, tangles of branches snagged my clothing, and the roar of the wind overhead drowned out any hints that might have helped me navigate. When I finally emerged from that labyrinth of twisted foliage, relief flooded me, until I realized the landmarks I'd counted on spotting, my weird rock and that little post with the streamer, weren't there. My eyes darted across the moonlit sand, looking for anything familiar, but the beach stretched on emptily. Salt-scented gusts lashed against me, making it impossible to see much of anything. Frustrated, I inched back into the woods, flipping on my phone's screen for a feeble glow. That light barely reached a few steps ahead, revealing only a tangle of wet ferns and shadows. At one point, something off in the distance made a noise, a low, resonant call that rose above the wind, oddly stretched and loud. It could have been my mind twisting normal forest sounds into something ominous, but it sent a surge of alarm through my body anyway. I told myself it was an owl or maybe a coyote, but even I didn't believe it. It didn't have the trademark yip or screech. This was different. a drawn-out tone that felt impossible to ignore. I crept forward, trying to keep calm. My feet rooted in place whenever I heard a rustle or detected a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. As the seconds dragged on, I noticed a pungent odor, damp and somehow animalistic. The wind couldn't carry it away fast enough. It gnawed at the edges of my thinking, fueling the idea that something far larger than an owl was lurking beyond my flashlight's pitiful radius. Then I heard the same unnerving sound again, but this time it reverberated from behind me, closer than before. It was a low, wavering moan that crescendoed in a way I couldn't have imagined an ordinary creature producing. My chest felt tight with a surge of adrenaline. I stumbled forward in a desperate attempt to get out of there, tangling my foot on an exposed root. My shoulder smacked against a trunk, and pain jolted down my arm, but I refused to stop. My only plan was to keep moving until I reached the beach or open ground, somewhere I could see whatever was out there. A short time later, I burst onto the sand again, breathless and shaking. My phone's light flickered off, so I was left with only the faint glow of the moon. The ocean lay in front of me, a slab of shifting darkness. For a moment I stood still, scanning the shoreline. The waves roared, but they couldn't drown out that faint call echoing in the wind. Somehow I knew it was trailing me. I forced myself to walk along the beach, eyes straining for that stupid rock, anything to anchor my bearings. My entire body felt raw, like every nerve ending was ready to snap. At one point I noticed what looked like a large shape dart between the trunks at the edge of the woods, but the swirl of sand and gusts made it impossible to confirm. If it had been my imagination, it was doing a damn good job of tormenting me. After what felt like hours of staggering along the sand, the rock finally came into view. That stone never looked so beautiful. My makeshift camp was right where I'd left it, which meant shelter for the night. Not much, but better than wandering out in the open. I sank onto my ground tarp, pressing a hand to my shoulder, trying to massage away the pain. My lungs still felt like they were on fire. For a long time I sat there, straining to catch any hint of the unknown noise. All I heard was the restless tide and the occasional gust slicing through the trees. At some point I dragged my sleeping bag over me and huddled inside. Normally, I might have drifted off to the hiss of waves, but fear kept me rigid. Every brush of wind through the nearby grass made me jump. I couldn't guarantee I was safe, but at least the open sky gave me a fighting chance to spot trouble before it reached me. Eventually, the brutal exhaustion won out. My eyes grew heavy, even though my pulse was still racing. Before I slipped into a restless doze, I grabbed my pocket knife and laid it beside me, just in case. The reality of what lurked in those woods was far from settled, and I had a feeling the night wasn't ready to let me off easy. My eyes snapped open at first light, though I couldn't say I truly slept. The wind had died to a low whistle, and the morning sky was a dull gray, casting just enough light for me to see I was still in one piece. My shoulder throbbed from last night's collision with that tree, and my legs ached in a way that told me I'd gone too hard trying to outrun something I couldn't even see. Shaking off the lingering fog in my head, I sat up and scanned the beach. It was eerily quiet. Normally, sunrise over the Pacific is breathtaking, pinkish clouds, golden water. But that morning, it felt subdued, like even the day was hesitant about showing up. Part of me hoped I'd find solid proof that the terror I'd felt in those woods was just my own overactive imagination. Then I noticed something odd near the water's edge. Impressions in the wet sand, bigger than I'd expect from any person walking around. They were spaced too far apart to be from a casual stroll. My pulse jumped. They could have been smoothed or warped by the tide, sure, but as I got closer, I realized they had a vague foot-like shape to them, elongated, broad. I crouched down, suddenly aware of how alone I was on that stretch of beach. My heart pounded harder when I noticed a line of these prints leading toward the tree line, exactly where I'd fled last night. I wanted to dismiss them, blame them on shifting sand or an odd trick of the current, but the winds howling in my memory and that unexplainable call I'd heard still weighed on me. Standing there, cold water lapping around my ankles, I felt more shaken than ever. Whatever had prowled those woods might have been right there on the beach, watching me as I bolted around in the dark. I hurried back to my makeshift camp and stuffed everything into my pack. There was no chance I'd linger another minute in that spot. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind behind me made my skin prickle. Turning my back on that gnarled coastal forest felt both necessary and dangerous, like something might leap out at me before I was out of reach. The walk through the trees in daylight was nowhere near as terrifying as at night, but my nerves were still on high alert. The occasional shaft of morning sun revealed just how twisted and close those branches were. Conifer needles and salt-laden air formed a pungent mix that sat heavy in my lungs. Even then, even with the sunlight, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. When I finally re-emerged into Grayland's campground, I almost didn't recognize the place. The single RV was gone. The site where the couple had been sleeping looked deserted as well. No people. No sign they'd ever been there. Maybe they packed up at dawn, or maybe they were gone long before I even woke. That chill at the back of my neck prickled again, making me wonder if I'd imagined the RV and the tent entirely. I didn't waste time. I hoofed it out to the highway and flagged down a passing truck, the driver throwing me a curious look when I practically jumped into the cab. I mumbled something about needing to get out of Grayland fast. He didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. We ended up stopping in a small coastal town not too far away. There was a diner there, fluorescent lights buzzing, the scent of bacon and coffee in the air. I sank into a booth, hands still shaking as I wrapped them around a steaming mug. When the waitress asked if I was okay, I managed a half smile and said something like, "Long night." She nodded like she'd heard it all before. A couple old-timers at the counter kept glancing over, probably picking up on my rattled vibe. Eventually, I summoned the nerve to ask them if they'd ever heard weird noises in the Grayland area. Their eyes flickered with a hint of recognition. One said he'd heard all sorts of stories. Sightings of large ape-like figures near the dunes, strange howls at odd hours. The other shrugged, calling them tall tales, but his mouth set in a way that said he wasn't entirely convinced of that. Later, after I'd changed into dry clothes and recharged my phone, I typed in every search term I could think of. Grayland screech, Bigfoot calls, Westport forest noises. The audio clips I found, those alleged Bigfoot whoops or howls, sent a jolt straight through me. Some had the same weird, resonant pitch I'd heard piercing the wind the night before. My throat went tight just listening to them. I can't say with 100% certainty what chased me through those tangled trees, or if anything literally followed me at all, but when I think back on that searing cry, on those footprints in the damp sand, and on the acrid smell that clung to the air, I can't deny something was out there, something bigger and stranger than a mere owl or deer. By the time I finally found a bus back toward Olympia, the morning sun had grown strong, casting long rays over the highway. I should have felt more at ease, but I realized I was still shaking. I kept replaying the night in my head. If I'd made one wrong move, taken one bad tumble, I might have still been out there, huddled in the dark with whatever that thing was. Even now, safe at home and scrolling through internet forums, I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed another side of that rugged Washington coastline, a side that rarely meets human eyes. Sure, I walked away rattled, but I walked away all the same, which is more than I can say for some folks who've vanished in thick forests and never shown up again. I didn't get the grand surf adventure I'd hoped for, and I doubt I'll be heading back to those dunes anytime soon. Still, that memory of hearing that unearthly cry slicing through the howling wind, the trackway in the sand, and the sense of a presence lurking in the gloom has carved itself into my story forever. It's a reminder that sometimes, out on the edges of the map, you're a guest in someone else's realm, and you don't always see your host until it's far too late. I remember the heat pressing down like a weight that afternoon, making every breath feel thick. My friend and I had set out for a casual hike a few miles from downtown Salt Lake City, figuring we'd escape the traffic noise and chaos for a while. The trail was narrow, weaving through dense undergrowth that tugged at our clothes, and we hadn't been walking long before sweat started trickling into our eyes. We finally stopped in a small clearing, where clusters of tall firs stood close enough to form a canopy overhead. I squinted at them, noticing how some trunks seemed angled against each other, almost like a teepee. My friend and I tossed around theories. Maybe campers had dragged them into that shape, or some weird storm had left them like that. None of our guesses felt convincing, and something about the arrangement set my nerves on edge. We'd just leaned against fallen logs to rest when a tremendous crash shattered the stillness. Branches rattled, needles spiraled down, and I felt a jolt of alarm. My head snapped toward the noise, eyes searching for the source. Deep in the undergrowth, I spotted movement. In the gloom of overlapping branches, a form about 6 feet tall darted through the brush. It had dark brown hair, patches of lighter fur around its midsection, then darker again along its legs. My mind immediately tried to twist it into something familiar, but the temperature alone made it impossible that anyone would be trekking around in a heavy outfit. I called out, my voice tight. "Hello? Anybody there?" My friend was already on his feet, pushing aside low-hanging branches to get a better look. No response. It was eerie how fast everything returned to total silence. We inched forward, scanning the area for footprints or broken limbs. The only clue we found was a wide depression in the thick layer of needles, a single mark, deeper and larger than the shape of my size 11 sandals. We strained our ears, hoping for a second crash, or at least the sound of something stomping away. Nothing. The forest around us seemed emptied of life. With the hairs on my arms prickling, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a stray hiker in an odd costume, or a shadow playing tricks on me. But my gut told me we'd crossed paths with something else. Despite the unease creeping through my body, we decided to keep moving. The trail ahead felt safer than lingering in that strange, silent pocket. I remember glancing back every few steps, half expecting that hairy figure to appear again. It never did. But from that moment on, the simple day hike I'd planned turned into a slow walk with my senses on high alert, always waiting for another crash in the undergrowth. Over the next few days, I found it almost impossible to focus on everyday life. My mind kept drifting back to that strange figure slipping through the firs, the odd print in the needles, and the question of what, or who, was lurking out there. Every time I tried to dismiss it, I'd remember how intense that moment felt and get that uneasy twist in my stomach all over again. It wasn't something I could write off as a trick of the light or a fleeting shadow. Finally, my friend and I agreed we had to head back. I wasn't about to do it alone, so we brought along 2 more people who were up for the challenge. They were both skeptics at first, rolling their eyes when we mentioned fur and footprints, but once we described how massive that impression was, and how quickly the figure had vanished, they got quiet. We stocked up on extra supplies, strong flashlights, fully charged phones for video, and a firm resolution that this time we'd be prepared for whatever we might find. We started early in the morning, hoping to reach the tree formation before the midday sun turned the trail into an oven. The 4 of us hiked in a line, maneuvering through dense brush like it was some uncharted terrain. Conversation was minimal. We'd crack small jokes here and there, but there was this underlying nervous energy, like we all suspected something was off and didn't want to jinx it by talking too much. Eventually, we reached the spot where we'd rested on the previous trip, the clearing with the bizarre teepee configuration. It looked different somehow, like the branches had shifted or more had been added. I couldn't help but wonder if something had returned to rearrange them. They were large, twisted limbs, not something you'd expect to be thrown together on a whim. The silence around us felt thick, like the atmosphere itself was warning us that this place wasn't ours to linger in. One of our new companions, Sarah, noticed a cluster of cracked branches piled in a weird pattern on the ground. It looked intentional, almost like the start of another structure. A few steps away, I saw old bark stripped off a trunk in a way that didn't look natural. We started taking photos and poking around, trying to see if there were any signs of footprints in the dirt or new scuffs on the bark. That's when we caught the faint sound of movement from up the slope, a shuffle or a shift in the leaves, low and heavy. We froze as a group, exchanging glances that held the same anxious thought. We weren't alone. We aimed our flashlights toward the dense undergrowth, their beams cutting through shadows. Nothing. Not even a startled bird fluttering away. Still, none of us relaxed. We found ourselves whispering like we were worried that raising our voices might provoke something. With that uneasy weight hanging over us, we headed into a small ravine, the same direction I was pretty sure our mystery creature had darted before. My pulse throbbed as the shadows deepened. The place reeked of damp soil and old foliage, a scent that somehow felt claustrophobic. It wasn't long before the daylight started fading. The canyon walls blocked out a lot of the afternoon's sun, and I realized we'd spent more time in that area than we'd planned. The thought of getting caught in near-dark conditions while searching for a massive unknown creature sent a bolt of anxiety through me. Another half hour of picking our way through thick vegetation, and we collectively decided we'd tested our luck enough. We turned around to head back, taking measured steps, all of us glancing over our shoulders every few seconds. The undergrowth seemed thicker now, or maybe it was just our nerves. Every snapped twig felt like an alarm, each rustle a potential threat waiting just beyond our sight. But despite the near-constant tension, we never saw a distinct shape or heard anything more than a stray crack of wood. When we finally reached the clearer part of the trail, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. We hurried out, not exactly running, but not taking a leisurely pace either. By the time we got to the trailhead parking area, nobody was in the mood to talk about what we'd seen, or hadn't seen. We just stood by our cars, exchanging uneasy glances like we'd all silently agreed. There was definitely something out there, and we weren't sure how close we'd come to it this time. Driving home, I kept reliving the moments we'd spent next to that tangle of broken branches, the silence pressing down on us, and that single distant noise that carried just enough heft to remind us we were intruders. Even if we hadn't caught more than a glimpse, it felt like a step further into a mystery that might be bigger than anything we were prepared for. And yet, a part of me knew we'd be back. Because once you sense something that strange, it's impossible to just walk away and forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dancing around the edge of something huge. After we got home from that second hike, the tension in my chest wouldn't let up. Every time I tried to sleep, I pictured the twisted branches, the strange footprints, the hushed rustle on the slope. Part of me was flat out terrified, but another part was hooked. I needed to know what we were dealing with, needed to see it with my own eyes, once and for all. It took some convincing, okay, borderline begging, but my friends agreed to go back one last time. This time, we planned it differently. No more flirting with sunset. We'd go in early, in broad daylight, do a thorough sweep, and be out before darkness had a chance to swallow us. We told ourselves that if we still couldn't find solid answers, we'd accept the mystery and move on. At least that was the plan. We set out at dawn, the rising sun casting warm light on the dusty trailhead. Even the walk leading up to the fir forest felt loaded with suspense, like the trees themselves knew our intentions. The forest canopy was still thick, though patches of light trickled in, illuminating swirling dust motes in the early morning air. It should have felt peaceful, but I was coiled tight with anticipation. By the time we reached the teepee-like structure, the sun was fully up. The weird arrangement of logs and branches looked even more deliberate in daylight. My friend, Sarah, who had been so skeptical before, just stood there shaking her head. She murmured something about how there was no way this was natural. It felt more like a constructed boundary marker than anything random. We combed the area systematically, marking any impressions, picking up bits of fur caught on broken branches. Yeah, fur. Not just a stray tuft here or there, but enough to notice a pattern. It was coarse, dark with lighter tips. We collected it carefully in small plastic bags, our minds spinning with possibilities. There was a smell too, musky, pungent, like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves. It made my stomach churn, but it also felt like proof that we weren't chasing ghosts. Eventually, we descended into that narrow ravine where we'd heard something moving on the second trip. It was cooler there, the sunlight hitting the ground only in scattered patches. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Giant boulders jutted out at odd angles, and fallen trees formed natural barricades, like something had been shaping the path to discourage visitors. That's when I saw it, just a flicker of motion from the corner of my eye. My throat went bone dry. I raised my hand to signal everyone else to stop. We stood dead still, every nerve on high alert. Between two tall firs, partially hidden by a thick screen of leaves, was a silhouette. Tall, stocky, covered in that same two-toned hair. It wasn't running this time, it was watching us. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. The creature shifted, stepping forward just enough for me to make out a thick, powerful frame. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I sensed the tension in its stance. My friend whispered, "Oh my God," and started fumbling for her phone, but I gently put my hand on her arm to still her. Something in the creature's posture told me it wasn't thrilled to see us, yet it wasn't charging either. It felt like a standoff. Then it made this deep, resonant sound, an almost guttural warning. The trees around us seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I swear I felt the noise more than heard it, like a low tremor through the ground. My legs wobbled, a primal instinct screaming that I was in the presence of something that could hurt me if it wanted to. But it didn't move closer. It stared for a long moment, as if weighing whether we posed a real threat. I raised my arms in a slow, open gesture, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. My entire body was on the verge of bolting, but I forced myself to hold my ground. The creature gave a strange huff, then slid back into the brush, ascending the slope with a speed and grace that left us standing there breathless. One moment, it was there. The next, the forest swallowed it whole. We didn't chase it. I think a few of us realized at the same time that chasing would be a monumentally bad idea. Instead, we just stood, gripping one another's arms, marveling that the standoff had ended without violence. My brain buzzed with a mix of relief, awe, and lingering fear. Part of me wished we had some perfect, crystal-clear footage to show the world. Another part knew it was enough just to have seen it and walked away in one piece. After a few shaky breaths, we gathered what composure we could and decided to head back. None of us wanted to press our luck. On the way down, we found the courage to talk quietly about what we'd seen. The footprints, the smell, the fur, and finally, that face, almost hidden behind the leaves. It felt like we'd intruded on another intelligence, something that had staked out its home here, way too close to civilization for comfort, but hidden by the thick undergrowth. It was near midday when we emerged onto the main trail. The sun shone brighter than I'd expected, the warmth on my shoulders a stark reminder that we hadn't been gone long in terms of hours. Yet it felt like we'd lived an entire lifetime in that ravine. The rest of the hike was silent, except for the rhythmic crunch of our boots, and the occasional shaky laugh whenever someone muttered, "What just happened?" At the parking lot, we regrouped around our cars, unsaid questions hanging in the air. We had hair samples and faint phone videos of leaves moving, but nothing that could truly capture what we experienced. Honestly, it hardly mattered. We knew we'd touched something beyond our day-to-day lives, and there was a powerful, almost sacred finality in leaving it behind undisturbed. By that afternoon, we promised we'd keep our eyes and ears open for other stories, other signs. But we all agreed we wouldn't intrude again. It was like we'd signed an unspoken pact with that forest. Respect its boundaries. Let the creature live as it was meant to. And maybe, just maybe, it would keep granting us safe passage. I haven't been back since, but I can't say I won't ever go. The memory still lingers in the back of my mind, especially when I'm alone at night. Every now and then, I relive that moment of eye contact, if you can call it that, and wonder if it might happen again. Strange as it sounds, there's a small part of me that hopes it does. Because for one brief moment, fear and fascination collided, and I realized there are still corners of our world that remain wild, vast, and deeply mysterious. I grew up on a stretch of land tucked behind Rattlesnake Ridge, an expanse of farmland and forest that stretched farther than my young eyes could measure. For most of my childhood, it felt like my personal playground. My older brother and I spent countless afternoons chasing each other across the fields, and if we wanted a change of pace, we'd wander down to this cluster of thin alder trees off the lower pasture. The trunks were so flexible that you could climb halfway up, then lean forward and ride them back down like a giant springboard. It was a thrill, branches snapping beneath us, the ground rushing up, both of us whooping with excitement. That was our world, wide open, full of life and possibility. One autumn day, everything changed. I remember the bite of the crisp air, the hint of damp moss as we hiked the gentle slope toward our favorite bendy alders. The two of us were already knee-deep in mud by the time we reached them, eager for the adrenaline we got from swaying to the ground. Snap, crash, just normal everyday noises that went along with our games. We knew what breaking branches sounded like. Small twigs made a quick pop. Thicker ones created this deeper crack. It never scared us, not until we heard something that shouldn't have been there. We'd just finished a round of our makeshift tree surfing when a different kind of snapping started echoing through the grove, louder, heavier. It cut through the air with a force I'd never experienced. My brother glanced at me, his smile twisting into alarm, and I realized he heard it too. We both froze. The cracking sounds kept rolling in, growing louder with each second, as if logs 2 or 3 times thicker than the ones we were playing on were being torn apart. I tried to make sense of it. We knew the rumble of bulldozers and tractors. Our dad worked those machines all the time. But this was different. Like some massive presence was crushing trunks underfoot. It felt too random, too wild for any piece of equipment. The worst part was we couldn't see the source of the noise. The trees formed a wall of leafy shadows around us, and beyond that, everything felt eerily dim. Suddenly, it all stopped. Not gradually. One second it was there, the next it was dead quiet. We were left standing with our breath ragged, our heads craned, scanning the alders for a glimpse of whatever was out there. A cold prickle of dread coiled in my gut. The land we knew so well felt strange and unwelcoming, like something dangerous was lurking just beyond our sight. My brother started to whisper something, maybe to tell me to head back, when a roar, or a howl, I don't even know how to label it, ripped through the silence. It was so powerful I could practically feel it in my chest. Every hair on my neck prickled, and my legs seemed to move on their own, stumbling backward away from the tree line. My brother was right beside me, muttering words under his breath that I couldn't make out. We didn't linger to see if the creature, if that's what it was, would step into view. We tore up that slope, sliding on loose gravel, nearly colliding with each other in our haste. I remember the metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. When we reached the house, we barged in through the back door, panting so hard it took a minute to speak. Our mom stood there, alarmed, but as soon as we tried to explain, babbling about snapping trees and an impossible roar, her face softened into a look I recognized all too well. Disbelief. "Probably a bear," she said, "or you two just got yourselves worked up." No matter how hard we insisted it was bigger, louder, more frightening than any bear, she wouldn't budge. She told us to clean off our muddy shoes and go about our day. That night, though, I could barely settle into my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts wandered back to the moment that relentless crashing fell silent, and how an unearthly roar seemed to rip through the air. The lower pasture, the place that had once felt like our personal amusement park, now felt like a different realm altogether. I wanted to forget it, chalk it up to an overactive imagination, but I couldn't push it from my mind. Later, I'd have to start waking up before dawn to feed our cattle down near those same alders. It was a chore I used to do with ease, no flashlight needed, comfortable in my own backyard. After what happened, I found myself standing at the door each morning, heart pounding as I peered outside at the black silhouettes of the trees. The thought of crossing that stretch of land made me shiver. I'd force myself to go, but every crunch of a leaf would raise the hairs on my arms. That roar played on a loop in my head. I should have known it was only the beginning. There was more to that roar than just a single terrifying afternoon. Deep down, a part of me sensed that whatever lurked in the alder grove wasn't finished leaving its mark on our property, or on me. It had been a few weeks since that day in the alder grove, and I was still on edge. During daylight, I managed to keep most of the worry tucked away, but once the sun dipped below the ridgeline, all bets were off. Sleeping became a nightly struggle. Every snapping twig outside turned my thoughts back to whatever had roared at us. My parents stuck to their theory that it was just a confused bear, though I think they noticed how tense I was each time I had to walk down to the barn. They offered no real comfort beyond that. Life on a farm meant chores didn't stop, fear or not. One evening, exhaustion finally got the better of me. I'd spent hours chasing down a stray calf and was yawning by dusk. I remember collapsing onto my bed, half-dressed, drifting in and out of sleep while a slice of moonlight cut across the bedroom floor. It must have been nearly 2 a.m. when I stirred, aware of my flip clock's faint glow. The display read 1:45, those bright, illuminated numbers casting a hazy light around the room. My eyes were gritty with fatigue, but nature was calling, so I swung my feet over the edge of the mattress. That was when I happened to glance at the window. At first, I saw just the road. We'd cleared a few trees near the house the previous summer, so I had an unobstructed view of the dirt path heading downhill. The moon was full and high, bathing everything in a faint silver tone. I blinked, trying to decide if my mind was playing tricks, because off to the right, near the tree line, there was something moving. It stepped into clearer view, tall, broad, and unlike any person I'd ever seen. Even at night I could make out the dark shape of towering shoulders. Its head looked proportionately big, though I couldn't see details. The fence down there was about 5 feet tall, yet the figure's torso hovered well above it. I froze, watching as it took 2 strides across the road. That's how I knew it wasn't human. No one could cross that span so quickly, let alone look so massive in the process. There was an unsettling grace to its movements, like it could glide without effort. My thoughts drifted back to that explosive roar in the alder grove, and a jolt of dread coursed through me. I realized it might be the same thing, some unknown creature roaming our land, crossing the pasture under the moon's gaze. Any hope that I'd imagined everything before evaporated in that moment. Panicking, I reached over to flip my clock face down, afraid that even that mild glow might give away my presence. Then I inched myself lower on the mattress, doing my best to slip out of view. Every breath felt like it echoed through the entire room. 1,000 questions tore through my mind. Would it come closer? Could it peer into my window if it wanted to? I had never felt so vulnerable, pressed into the creaking springs of my own bed. Outside, the figure vanished behind the angled slope of the hill. I lay there in the darkness, unmoving, praying it would keep going. My heart pounded against my ribcage, and each passing second crawled by. I considered jumping up to close the curtains, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Too risky. After a while, silence settled back in, broken only by the croak of a frog somewhere near the stream. Still, I stayed pinned in place. The urge to flee or scream battled with the instinct to remain absolutely still. Dawn eventually sneaked in through the window, orange light stretching across the floor. Only then did I dare to move. My body ached from being tensed all night, and my eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. No matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't dismiss what I'd witnessed. Whatever I'd seen was real, and it was big. I had no doubt it was connected to the ruckus in the alder grove. Part of me wanted to warn everyone, shout that we needed to barricade the house. But I also knew my parents would just shake their heads. My brother might believe me. He'd heard that roar too, but I wasn't sure how much more I could say before sounding hysterical. That morning, the chore list was waiting for me as usual, pinned to the fridge. I had no choice but to head outside again, the memory of that giant silhouette still etched in my mind. The world felt just a little less secure, and I realized with growing unease that I might never view our farm the same way again. The morning after I spotted that silhouette outside my window, I tried one last time to convince my parents something far bigger than any bear roamed our property. My mother cut me off with a patient smile, telling me to worry less about monsters and more about my chores. My dad, equally skeptical, suggested I pack some pepper spray if I was so nervous. It was maddening. Only my older brother believed me, and that was mostly because he'd been there in the alder grove when the forest erupted with that terrifying roar. Even then, I sensed a flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he wondered if maybe I was overhyping the nighttime sighting. Still, I couldn't let it go. Every trip to the barn, every trek to the far pasture, I found myself scanning the tree line for anything out of place. At night, I'd lie awake, listening for heavy footsteps or another earth-shaking roar. Sleep became rare. Each day, I was more convinced our land wasn't ours alone. When my brother finally admitted he was tired of tossing and turning himself, we made a pact to figure it out, or at least confront whatever was lurking. We waited until the moon rose high again, just shy of full. Under the cover of darkness, we snuck out of the house with a flashlight and a hand-me-down camera. We agreed to stake out the edge of the property line near the dirt road, where I'd last seen that colossal figure. The night was cold enough to sting our lungs when we breathed, and the air felt heavy with apprehension. Beyond the faint ring of our flashlight's beam, the world was a black canvas. Even the barn, usually a comforting sight, looked like a looming shape of wooden slats and rusted metal. At first, we heard only the hum of crickets and an occasional distant shuffle from the cattle. Then a low, resonant thump reached our ears. It sounded like something incredibly large was maneuvering through the undergrowth, branches scratching together in the dark. We tensed, gripping each other's arms for support. The cattle started to move restlessly in their pen, letting out anxious moos as though sensing a nearby threat. Suddenly, a roar shattered the silence, very much like the one we'd heard weeks ago. It reverberated through my ribcage, urgent and furious. My brother fumbled with the flashlight, nearly dropping it. In that half-second of wild, swinging light, I spotted a hulking outline at the far end of the pasture, partially masked by shadow. Before we could get a better look, the roar came again. It wasn't closing in. It felt more like a warning. My brother yanked me backward, and we sprinted for the house. My feet barely registered the ground. I expected to feel hot breath at my back, or sense the pounding of massive footsteps behind us. But that didn't happen. Once we reached the porch, we dared to glance over our shoulders. The pasture lay still and dark, the cattle jittery but not in full panic. The creature, if it had followed at all, had melted back into the night. The next day, our parents noted how rattled we looked, but no miraculous conversion happened. Still, the two of us had our proof, at least in our own minds. We knew something had chosen our property as part of its domain. I asked myself if we should call the police or maybe some wildlife official, but all I had was a murky outline and a roar that defied any normal explanation. In the end, we settled into an unspoken deal. We'd be more careful, move quietly around the lower fields, and leave it to its own territory. Over time, the nights became calmer for us. I never forgot the heft of that roar or the powerful shape that left me trembling, but it seemed content to keep its distance if we kept ours. I like to think our land holds more than meets the eye, a slice of raw wilderness where man doesn't fully reign. Sometimes I still wonder if I should have fought harder for the world to believe my story. Then again, maybe this strange truce was exactly what let life go on, and that was enough for me. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool, fresh air of the forest fill my lungs. There was nothing like it. The Pacific Northwest was my favorite place to get away from everything. No people, no noise, just the green forest all around me. The tall trees, thick moss, and sunlight shining through the branches made me feel like I was stepping into another world. I've done a lot of solo trips, but this one felt different somehow. I couldn't quite figure out why. Getting ready for these trips is always a careful process. I had my camera, lenses, extra batteries, camping gear, and enough food for a week. I double-checked everything before heading into the deep woods. There was no room for mistakes out here. Once I was sure everything was ready, I lifted my heavy pack over my shoulder, feeling the familiar weight. It made me smile, a reminder that I was ready for whatever adventure lay ahead. The forest was amazing. The air was so fresh it almost made me dizzy, and the earthy smell of moss and fallen leaves wrapped around me like a blanket. I walked for hours, soaking in the beauty of the place. The light shifted as the sun moved higher, casting golden beams between the trees. Eventually, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, near a gentle stream that bubbled over smooth rocks. I could already tell it was going to be peaceful. I pitched my tent and set up a small fire pit, ready to spend the evening listening to the sounds of the forest. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I sat by the fire, eating a simple dinner. The woods around me seemed to darken quickly, the shadows stretching out like fingers. I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness at night, but tonight, something was different. The usual rustling of small animals and the chirping of insects. All of it faded until there was nothing but silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel calm. No, this silence was heavy, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd been out in the woods many times, and I'd felt uneasy before. It was probably just the darkness playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to get comfortable in my sleeping bag. But even as I closed my eyes, the strange stillness kept me on edge. I don't know how long I'd been lying there, half awake, when I heard it. A howl, low, deep, and so far off it almost didn't sound real. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The sound echoed through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was something else. Something that made my stomach twist with fear. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe just the wind or some animal I didn't know. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The howl came again, a bit closer this time, and I felt my heart start to pound. I sat up, peering out through the small mesh window of my tent. I could smell a strong, musty odor, like a wet dog times 10. The forest was pitch black, the fire now just a pile of glowing embers. I could see nothing beyond the dim light they cast. Another howl, this one even closer, echoed through the woods. It was deep, almost like it was vibrating through the ground. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't used to feeling scared out here. The forest was my home away from home, but right now, it felt different, like I was somewhere I didn't belong. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting. But the howls eventually stopped, replaced by that same heavy silence. It was almost worse, not knowing if whatever made that sound was still out there, hidden in the dark. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense up, my ears straining to catch the slightest noise. Whatever was out there, I had the feeling it wasn't just passing through. And as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of my tent, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. The howls from last night were still fresh in my mind as I crawled out of my tent in the early morning light. The sun barely peeked over the treetops, and everything around me looked washed out and gray. I tried to convince myself that what I heard had been nothing more than my imagination or some strange animal call. But even as I packed up my gear for the day, the memory of that deep echoing sound made my hands shake. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, trying to focus on capturing the beauty of the forest with my camera. I photographed the sunlight filtering through the leaves, the dewdrops glistening on ferns, and even a curious squirrel that scampered close enough for a picture. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. It was like something was watching me, just out of sight, hiding in the shadows between the trees. By the time the sun started to dip again, I was back at my camp. The quiet of the forest was heavy, almost like it had been last night. The stream nearby bubbled softly, but even that sound seemed muted, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to distract myself by making dinner, beans and rice, nothing fancy. but my eyes kept darting to the tree line. Every shadow seemed to move. Every flicker of light made me jump. As night fell, I built up the fire, hoping the flickering flames would chase away my fear. I sat close to it, feeling the warmth on my face, but that strange silence returned. The usual noises of the forest, the chirps, the rustles, the soft scurrying of small animals, all seemed to vanish again. I couldn't help but feel like the forest itself was warning me. Then, just like the night before, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and close. My heart skipped a beat, and I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were the trees and shadows. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, circling my camp. They were close enough that I could feel the vibrations in the ground. I shined the light around frantically, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a split second I saw something, a flash of movement at the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I saw eyes glowing like embers, staring at me from the darkness. They were large, higher up than they should have been for any normal animal, and they were watching me. Panic gripped me. I didn't know what to do. I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" There was no answer, just the heavy footsteps continuing to circle. I stood up, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I turned in every direction, trying to keep the creature in sight. But it stayed just out of reach, always at the edge, always in the shadows. The night felt endless. I stayed by the fire, clutching the flashlight until my hand ached. Every time I thought the footsteps had stopped, they would start again, slow and deliberate, as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't sleep. I was too afraid to even close my eyes. By the time dawn finally broke, the footsteps had faded away, leaving only the heavy silence behind. I stepped out of my tent, my whole body aching from tension and lack of sleep. The first thing I saw were the tracks. Huge footprints pressed deep into the ground, circling my camp. Claw marks gouged into the nearby trees, marks that were far too big to belong to any animal I knew. A chill ran down my neck as I looked around. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just curious. It was watching me, following me, and I had the sinking feeling that if I didn't leave soon, it would do more than just watch. I had to get out before it was too late. I knew I had to leave. There was no question about it anymore. The footprints, the claw marks, the way the footsteps had circled my camp all night. It was clear that whatever was out there was not going to let me be. My hands shook as I hurried to pack up my gear. I had never packed so fast in my life. Every moment I stayed here felt like a risk, like I was being hunted. I could feel the silence of the forest pressing down on me, thicker than ever before. Even the gentle murmur of the stream nearby had gone quiet. It was as if the whole forest knew what was happening, and it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. My heart pounded as I slung my pack over my shoulder, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, always expecting to see something step out from between the trees. I started my trek back, my legs moving quickly despite the weight of my pack. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My instincts screamed at me to move faster, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose my way in my panic. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, but it was hard when every sound of leaves moving, every breaking of a twig made my heart jump. I hadn't gone far when I heard it, a sudden loud crash behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw the trees swaying violently, as if something massive had just pushed through them. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. My feet pounded the forest floor, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at my face and arms, and the weight of my pack made every step feel like a struggle. But I couldn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the heavy, crashing footsteps, the deep, guttural growls that sent chills down my spine. It was close, too close. I could almost feel its presence, like a dark shadow looming over me. I didn't dare look back. I focused on the path ahead, dodging trees, leaping over roots, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever was chasing me. The The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blurring together as I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going. I had to. I couldn't let it catch me. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I stumbled, my foot slipping on the edge of a steep ravine I hadn't seen in my panic. I fell hard, the world spinning around me as I tumbled down the slope. I hit the ground with a thud, the air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment, everything was a blur of pain and dizziness. I struggled to my feet, my whole body aching. The ravine was deep, and I was lucky I hadn't broken anything. But I didn't have time to think about that. I looked up, my eyes widening as I saw the shadowy Bigfoot figure standing at the edge of the ravine, its glowing eyes locked on me. It was huge, at least 9 feet tall, its fur dark and matted. It let out a roar that echoed through the forest, a sound so deep and powerful that it shook me to my core. But then, to my surprise, it stopped. It stood there, staring down at me, its eyes burning like embers. For a moment, it was as if we were locked in a silent standoff. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths coming in shaky gasps. The creature let out a deep, rumbling growl, then slowly stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. There was an intense, musty smell after that, made my eyes water. I didn't wait to see if it would change its mind. I turned and ran again, my legs barely holding me up as I scrambled away from the ravine. My car wasn't far now. I could see the edge of the forest, the glint of sunlight reflecting off the metal. I stumbled towards it, my heart pounding with desperation. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook. I threw open the door, jumped in, and slammed it shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I started the engine, my eyes darting to the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again. But the forest was still, the shadows deep and quiet. I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road blurred beneath me as I sped away, the forest slowly fading into the distance. The terror lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. I knew I had escaped, but I also knew that I would never forget what I had seen. Some places, I realized, were meant to stay wild and untouched, places that guarded their secrets with a primal, terrifying force. And I had been lucky to get away. I don't plan on going into those woods again. The Appalachian mountains were beautiful, no doubt about that. When the sun set behind those tall peaks, everything seemed to glow in shades of orange and pink. It almost made me forget how eerie the forest could be when the night settled in. Almost. I was Jake, just a college kid spending my summer working as a camp counselor. It was my job tonight to keep watch while everyone else slept in their cabins. I took the night watch shift because, well, I wanted to prove I could handle it. Plus, it was kind of boring to sit around the campfire all the time. I thought it might be nice to have some quiet out in the woods, just me and my flashlight. Boy, was I wrong. The first hour was fine. I walked around the edge of the camp, my flashlight swinging side to side, making the trees look like dark, shifting giants. I could hear the crickets singing, and sometimes an owl would hoot in the distance. The camp was peaceful, and I kept thinking back to all the goofy things the campers did earlier that day. One kid, Benny, tried to toast a marshmallow without a stick and almost set his sleeve on fire. I laughed to myself, shaking my head. But then, things started to get strange. It started with a rustling sound. At first, I figured it was just the wind moving through the branches, but it kept happening, like something was moving out there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stopped walking, trying to listen closely. The air felt different, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or maybe one of the campers sneaking around for a prank. But my gut told me something else. Something wasn't right. The rustling grew louder, and then I heard it, a branch snapping. It wasn't the kind of noise a small animal would make. It was louder, heavier, like someone or something was out there. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath, giving it a quick shake. The beam steadied, but my hands were trembling now. I tried to keep moving, but the feeling of unease grew with every step. My ears strained to catch every sound, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, circling the camp. My heart started to pound in my chest, each thud echoing in my ears. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Then came the worst part. I heard a breath, a deep, raspy breath, coming from right behind me. I whipped around so fast I almost tripped over my own feet, but when I looked there was nothing. Only the empty darkness, and the beam of my flashlight cutting through it. I felt my stomach twist with fear. I wasn't alone. I could feel it in my bones. My eyes dropped to the ground, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Big, clawed footprints pressed into the dirt, right in front of me. They definitely weren't from any animal I knew. My heart was hammering now, my whole body buzzing with fear. I had to get back to the main cabin. I had to tell someone. But every step I took felt like the forest was closing in on me, the trees leaning closer, the shadows growing darker. Suddenly I heard branches snapping again, this time louder, closer. The footsteps were following me. My breathing quickened, and I forced myself to move faster, almost tripping over roots and rocks in my rush. I could feel the eyes on me, watching, waiting. Whatever it was out there, and it was getting closer. The silence of the night had turned into something threatening, something that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to make it back to the cabin, but fear was like a weight on my shoulders, slowing me down. I could hear the breathing again, the heavy, deep breaths of something that didn't belong here. I took one last look over my shoulder, and in the moonlight, I saw the shadows shift, something moving between the trees. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, the sounds of snapping branches and heavy footsteps following me as I sprinted towards the cabin, my heart pounding, fear driving me forward. Whatever was out there, I knew one thing for sure. This night was far from over. I ran. I ran like I never had before, my feet pounding against the dirt, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, shifting and twisting with every step I took. My heart was hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. I didn't care if I tripped or if I lost my way. I just had to get away from whatever was out there. The footsteps behind me were getting louder, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Each thud was heavier, more deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was chasing me knew exactly where I was going. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, my eyes darting around, trying to make out anything in the darkness that would give me a clue about where to go. I had to get to the ranger station. That was my only chance. I turned off the main path, crashing into the underbrush. Branches tore at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I could still hear it behind me, the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves. I knew it was close, too close. A howl echoed through the forest, a deep, chilling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, angry, hungry, and not human. My legs felt like they were moving through water, the fear pulling me down, making every step harder. I stumbled down a small hill, my feet sliding on the loose dirt. For a moment, I thought I was going to fall, but I managed to catch myself, barely keeping my balance. I could hear the creature getting closer, its breathing ragged and deep, like it was savoring the chase. I didn't dare look back. I was too scared of what I might see. I spotted the outline of the ranger station through the trees, the small building barely visible in the darkness. My chest tightened with hope, and I pushed myself harder, forcing my legs to move faster. I burst out of the trees and onto the clearing in front of the station. My fingers fumbled with the door handle, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was locked. But then it gave way, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The whole building shook as something slammed into the door, the force of it nearly knocking me off my feet. I backed away, my heart pounding, my eyes darting around the small room. The station was dark, lit only by the moonlight streaming in through the broken windows. Maps were scattered across a dusty table, and there, on the wall, was the radio. I rushed over to it, my hands trembling as I tried to find the right frequency. The creature outside let out another howl, the sound vibrating through the walls. I could hear its footsteps circling the station, the floorboards rattling as it slammed against the walls. The radio crackled to life, and I let out a shaky breath, my voice barely more than a whisper as I called for help. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help!" A voice came through, crackling and faint, but before I could answer, the door splintered under a massive blow. I turned, my eyes wide with terror, as a clawed arm reached through the gap, swiping at the air. My eyes darted around the room, and I spotted an old rusted hatchet leaning in the corner. I grabbed it, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. I swung it at the arm, the creature letting out a growl of pain. The door was breaking, and I knew I couldn't stay here. The creature wasn't just trying to get in, it was toying with me, enjoying my fear. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I made a decision. I hurled the hatchet at the creature, the blade grazing its shoulder. It let out an enraged roar, and I took my chance. I ran to the nearest window, throwing myself through it. Glass shattered around me, cutting into my skin as I hit the ground outside. I pushed myself up, my whole body aching. The creature was still behind me, its roars echoing through the night. I ran, the darkness closing in around me, my only thought to keep moving, to survive. The headlights of a truck appeared in the distance, and I felt a flicker of hope. I stumbled into the open, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a halt, and a ranger jumped out, grabbing me and pulling me into the vehicle. The door slammed shut and the truck sped away, the tires kicking up dirt. I looked back, seeing the creature standing at the edge of the forest, its eyes glowing in the darkness, filled with fury. I collapsed against the seat, my body trembling, exhaustion washing over me. I knew I was lucky to be alive, but I also knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. The ranger's truck sped down the narrow road, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and every breath felt like fire. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature chasing us, but all I could see were the trees, rushing by in a blur. The ranger beside me was talking into his radio, calling for backup, but his voice seemed far away, like I was hearing it through water. All I could think about was the creature, the glowing eyes, the way it moved, how close it had been. The ranger must have noticed my shaking hands because he reached over and gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe now, kid," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't so sure. I knew that thing was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. The truck pulled up to another ranger station, this one larger and more secure looking than the last. The ranger helped me out of the truck, and we hurried inside. The door slammed shut behind us, and he locked it, sliding a heavy metal bar across for good measure. The station was brighter, with more lights and a big map spread out on a table in the middle. There were a couple of other rangers there too, their faces serious as they listened to what had happened. I tried to explain everything. The footsteps, the howling, the way it had chased me, but my words kept getting jumbled. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath. One of the rangers handed me a bottle of water, and I took a sip, trying to calm down. They were talking about searching the woods, trying to track the creature, but all I could think about was how it had looked at me, like it knew me, like it wanted me. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside. My heart skipped a beat, and everyone in the room froze. The ranger who had driven me there moved to the window, peering out into the dark. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. He nodded to the others, and they all moved towards the door, their flashlights and weapons ready. I wanted to tell them not to go, that it was too dangerous, but the words caught in my throat. The door creaked open, and the rangers slipped outside, leaving me alone in the station. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the distant rustling of leaves outside. I moved closer to the table, my eyes darting around the room, looking for anything I could use to protect myself. My gaze landed on a flare gun, half buried under a pile of papers. I grabbed it, my fingers tightening around the handle. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The minutes felt like hours. I strained to hear any sound from outside, voices, footsteps, anything. but all I heard was the wind. Then, out of nowhere, there was a deep, guttural growl. It was close. Too close. My stomach twisted with fear, and I backed up until I hit the wall. The flare gun clutched tightly in my hands. The window shattered. Glass sprayed across the room, and I ducked, covering my head. When I looked up, I saw it. The creature. Its glowing eyes staring right at me through the broken window. Its lips curled back, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth, and it let out a low, menacing growl. I could feel the fear gripping me, freezing me in place. I knew I had to move, had to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. The creature lunged, its massive arm reaching through the window, claws scraping against the floor. I raised the flare gun, my hands trembling so badly I could barely aim. I pulled the trigger, and the flare shot out, a bright, blinding light filling the room. The creature let out a roar, jerking back, its eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, throwing myself through the door at the back of the station. I could hear the creature's enraged growls behind me, the sound of it tearing at the walls. I stumbled out into the night, my legs barely able to carry me. The woods were dark, the trees looming like shadows, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. In the distance, I saw more headlights, more rangers arriving. I waved my arms, shouting, my voice hoarse. The truck skidded to a stop, and the rangers jumped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of them grabbed me, pulling me behind the truck as the others moved towards the station, their weapons raised. I collapsed against the side of the truck, my whole body trembling, tears streaming down my face. I could hear the creature's roars, the shouts of the rangers, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I was alive, but I knew this wasn't over. That thing was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop, not until it got what it wanted. And somehow I knew that something was me. The hike up the Rocky Mountains was tough, but we didn't care. We were too excited to be out here, far away from everything, just us and the wild. The air smelled of pine, and the sky was so clear that you could almost reach out and touch the clouds. I remember looking over at Kyle, who had the biggest grin on his face, like a kid on Christmas morning. We all felt it, the thrill of adventure, the freedom. Matt led the way, always a few steps ahead, pointing out deer tracks and telling us about the best spots for hunting. When we finally set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the mountains, painting everything in gold and orange. We got a fire going, and before long, we were laughing, roasting marshmallows, and talking about everything and nothing. It felt perfect. I could hear the crackle of the fire, the rustling of the wind in the trees, and the distant calls of animals. The world felt big and peaceful, like we were the only people left on it. But then, just as the night started settling in, we heard it, a noise from deep in the woods. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was this low, rumbling growl, almost like a mix between a bear and something else. I looked over at Kyle and I could see the unease in his eyes. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Doug just laughed, shaking his head. "Probably just a bear," he said, trying to brush it off. But I could tell Kyle wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. The noise came again, this time closer. It was louder, more distinct, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It was like the woods themselves were groaning, something deep and ancient that had no place in the modern world. Trevor turned his head, squinting into the darkness, but he didn't say anything. I think we were all waiting for someone else to say it, to admit that it wasn't just a bear, but nobody did. We tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. The fire didn't seem as warm, and the darkness around us felt thicker, like it was pressing in. We eventually crawled into our tents, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that noise again, echoing in my head. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the unease stuck with me. The next day, we kept moving, deeper into the mountains. The forest felt different, though. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by this heavy silence that made my skin crawl. Trevor swore he saw something, a large shadow moving between the trees, but he quickly laughed it off, saying he must have imagined it. I wanted to believe him, but the way his eyes kept darting back to the woods told me he wasn't so sure. By the time we set up camp again that night, I think we were all on edge, even if no one wanted to admit it. The laughter from the night before was gone, replaced by forced smiles and nervous glances. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire again, but it didn't feel the same. The shadows seemed longer, darker, and the forest felt like it was watching us. Then, just as the fire started to die down, we heard it again. That same guttural growl, but this time, it was closer. Much closer. Kyle's face went pale, and even Doug, who'd been so confident before, looked worried. I felt my heart start to pound, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. We were not alone. Something was out there, watching us, and it was getting closer. By the third day, we knew something was very wrong. The forest was way too quiet, and that strange feeling of being watched never went away. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. It felt like the woods had eyes, and they were locked on us. We tried to stay calm, but we couldn't ignore the tension that hung over us. No one was laughing anymore. We all just wanted to get out of there. That morning, we found them, the footprints. They were huge, way bigger than any bear print I'd ever seen. The tracks were deep, like whatever made them was heavy, and they circled our camp like it had been watching us all night. Matt knelt down, his face serious. He ran his fingers along the edge of the print, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a bear," he said quietly. No one argued with him. We all knew he was right. Panic started to set in. We packed up our gear as fast as we could, not even bothering to eat breakfast. I could feel my heart racing, my hands trembling as I rolled up my sleeping bag. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the trees. Matt took charge, telling us we needed to head back to the trailhead. No one argued. We just wanted to leave. As we started hiking back, the feeling of being watched only got worse. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer, the shadows darker. I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes that seemed to move just as I turned my head. Trevor was walking next to me, and I could tell he felt it too. He kept glancing around, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Do you see that?" he whispered at one point, but when I looked there was nothing there. Still, I knew he wasn't imagining it. We were all seeing it. By the time the sun started to dip low in the sky, we were exhausted. The hike was tough, and the constant fear made it even harder. We decided to make camp one last time before we reached the trailhead. No one wanted to stop, but we didn't have a choice. We were too tired to keep going, and it would be dangerous to hike in the dark. We set up our tents in a small clearing, and Matt built a fire, though it didn't feel comforting like before. The flames flickered weakly, casting long dancing shadows that made the darkness seem even more alive. We sat around the fire, not talking much. The silence was heavy, like we were all waiting for something to happen, and then, it did. The growl came again, but this time, it was so close that I could feel it in my chest, a deep rumbling sound that made my whole body tense up. I looked at Kyle, and his face was as white as a sheet. Doug, who had always been the one to laugh things off, looked terrified. He gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles turning white. Suddenly there was a crash from the trees and I saw it, a massive figure, just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, covered in dark fur, its eyes glowing in the flickering light. For a second, none of us moved. We were frozen, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. Then it let out a roar, a sound so loud and so full of anger that it felt like the ground itself was shaking. Everything erupted into chaos. Matt shouted for us to grab our gear, but before we could do anything, the creature lunged forward. I saw Kyle get grabbed, his scream echoing through the night as the thing dragged him into the darkness. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The screams stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was worse than the roar. Matt grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "We have to go. Now!" he yelled. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We grabbed what we could and ran, the forest around us a blur of shadows and fear. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. Branches slapped at my face, and I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance. All I could think about was getting away, about surviving. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Somehow, we made it to a steep hill, and we half ran, half slid down it, the creature's roars echoing behind us. At the bottom, we didn't stop. We just kept moving, pushing through the pain and the fear, knowing that if we stopped, even for a second, we wouldn't make it out alive. By the time the sun started to rise, we were still running. My legs felt like they were made of lead, every step a struggle, but the fear kept me going. I could hear Matt and Doug breathing heavily beside me, and Trevor, limping along with his twisted ankle, was barely keeping up. We were all running on pure adrenaline, the roars of that creature echoing in our ears, pushing us forward. We had no idea where we were going. The forest all looked the same, dark, endless, and filled with shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Matt led the way, his face set with determination, though I could see the fear in his eyes every time he glanced back at us. He kept telling us we were close, that we just needed to keep going a little longer, but I wasn't sure if he even knew where we were anymore. The creature was still out there. Every once in a while we'd hear its heavy footsteps crashing through the trees, or its growl, low and menacing, coming from somewhere in the distance. It was like it was toying with us, letting us think we might have a chance, only to remind us it was still there, still hunting us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat feeling like it was going to tear me apart. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, we saw it. The edge of the forest. It was still far off, but I could see the sky beyond the trees, a lighter shade of blue that meant we were finally getting close to the trailhead. "There!" Matt shouted, pointing. I felt a surge of hope, and somehow I found the strength to keep going, to push myself a little harder. But the creature wasn't done with us. I heard it again, a crashing sound behind us, closer than ever. I glanced back and saw it, a massive shape moving between the trees, its eyes locked on us. It let out a roar, and I felt my whole body go cold. We were so close, but I knew it could catch us if it wanted to. We had to make it to the truck. It was our only chance. We stumbled out of the forest, the sunlight blinding after so long in the shadows. The truck was there, just a few yards away, and I felt a wave of relief. We ran for it, and Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. Doug and I helped Trevor into the back seat, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature burst out of the woods any second. Matt finally got the door open and we scrambled inside. I slammed the door shut just as I saw it, a massive dark figure emerging from the tree line. It was even bigger in the daylight, its fur matted and its eyes glowing with fury. Matt started the engine, and I screamed at him to go, to get us out of there. The truck roared to life, and we sped away, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I looked back, watching as the creature stood there, its eyes following us as we drove away. It didn't chase us. It just stood there watching until the forest swallowed it up again, and it was gone. The silence in the truck was heavy, the only sound our ragged breathing and the rumble of the engine. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We had made it out, but we had lost Kyle, and the weight of that hung over us like a dark cloud. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the creature was still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, watching, waiting, and I knew that I would never forget the sound of its roar, the sight of those glowing eyes in the darkness. We had survived, but a part of me knew that we were leaving something behind in those mountains, something that would never let us go. It was supposed to be a fun family vacation, a chance to get away from all the stress of our everyday lives and just be together. When we arrived at the cabin, it seemed like the perfect place, exactly what we needed. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick, towering trees. It looked like something out of an old storybook, with its wooden porch and stone chimney. The air smelled like pine needles and fresh earth, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream somewhere in the forest. My dad, Mike, seemed especially happy. He stretched his arms above his head and grinned. "See, guys? Isn't this great? No distractions, no city noise, just us and nature." I wanted to believe him. My mom, Laura, smiled too, though I could see her eyes scanning the forest, as if she was trying to get used to how quiet it was. My brother Jake was already pulling his bag out of the car, and I followed, eager to get settled. Inside the cabin, it was even cozier than I expected. The floors creaked when we walked, and the fireplace looked like it had been used 1,000,000 times before. We unpacked and settled in, and by the time the sun started to go down, we were all sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and joking around. It felt almost perfect. Almost. That night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was strange. A low, deep sound, almost like a growl. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. The cabin was dark, and the only light came from the moon shining through the curtains. I glanced over at Jake, who was still asleep in the bed across the room. Maybe it was just an animal? I tried to convince myself, but something about it made my skin prickle. The next morning, I wasn't the only one who had heard it. Mom was in the kitchen, her face pale as she looked out the window. "Did anyone else hear noises last night?" she asked. Dad shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the wind or some animal wandering nearby. He always tried to keep things calm, but I could tell Mom wasn't convinced. After breakfast, we decided to explore a bit. We hiked down a narrow trail that led away from the cabin, and Jake found a good spot for fishing by the stream. For a little while, it felt like things were normal again. But as we walked back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there, just the trees and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When we got back, that's when we saw them. Footprints, huge ones, circling the cabin. They were pressed deep into the mud, each one almost twice the size of my dad's boot. My heart started to pound, and I looked at my parents. Dad frowned, trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. "Probably just some prank," he said, but his voice didn't sound so sure. Mom didn't say anything. She just stared at the prints, her face getting even paler. Jake and I exchanged a nervous glance. I wanted to believe Dad, but those prints, they didn't look like something someone would make for fun. They looked real, and whatever had made them was huge. We tried to go on with our day, but the feeling of unease never left. Even when we were inside the cabin, I felt like there were eyes on us, watching from the forest. Every little sound made me jump, the creak of the floor, the rustle of branches outside. At one point, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, just a shadow slipping out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. That night, as the sun disappeared and the forest turned pitch black, I couldn't help but feel that whatever was out there was getting closer, and I wasn't sure if we were safe in the cabin after all. It was late when it started. The heavy, thudding footsteps that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep because of the uneasy feeling in my stomach. When I heard the first thud, I froze. It sounded like something, or someone, was walking outside, just beyond the walls. And it wasn't just the sound. I could feel the vibrations, like whatever it was had real weight. I glanced over at Jake. He was sitting up too, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the cabin. I could hear the floorboards creak as Mom and Dad got out of bed, their whispers coming from the other room. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just a tiny bit. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, a huge, dark shape moving just beyond the tree line, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. I let the curtain fall back, my hands shaking. "Jake, there's something out there," I whispered. He didn't respond, just stared at me, his face pale. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the front of the cabin. It sounded like something had hit the wall, hard. Mom screamed and Dad shouted for everyone to stay calm. But how could we stay calm? The thing outside was trying to get in. "Everyone in the back room now," Dad yelled. I grabbed Jake's arm and we ran, Mom and Dad right behind us. We slammed the door shut and pushed a dresser in front of it, the sound of our heavy breathing filling the room. I could hear the creature outside, its growls deep and guttural, and then the splintering sound of wood as it began to pound on the front door. "What is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. All I knew was that we had to get out and fast. Dad's eyes were wide and I could see him thinking, trying to come up with a plan. "The cellar," he said finally. "We have to get to the cellar. It's our only chance." He looked at Mom, and she nodded, though her face was white with fear. We moved as quietly as we could, slipping out of the back room and into the kitchen. The front door was barely holding on, the wood splintering with each blow from the creature. I held my breath as Dad opened the cellar door, motioning for us to go down. One by one, we climbed into the darkness, the air cold and damp around us. In the cellar, it was pitch black, and I could hear Jake breathing fast beside me. Dad closed the door above us, and we all crouched there, listening. The sound of the door upstairs being smashed open made my heart feel like it was going to explode. The creature was inside. Dad found a small window near the ground, just big enough for us to crawl through. He smashed it open, the noise making me flinch. "Go," he whispered, and we did. I crawled through the window, feeling the cold night air on my face. Jake followed, then Mom and Dad. We were outside, but we weren't safe. Not yet. We ran, our feet pounding on the ground, the forest a blur around us. Behind us, I could hear the creature roar, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the trees. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart pounding, my legs burning, hoping that somehow we could make it out of this alive. The cold night air cut into my lungs as we ran. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground seemed to blur beneath my feet. I could barely see where I was going, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stop. None of us could. The roar of the creature behind us echoed through the forest, loud enough that it seemed to shake the trees. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out almost every other sound except for the heavy thud of our footsteps. Jake stumbled ahead of me, his foot catching on a root, and he went sprawling. I reached down, grabbing his arm, my fingers trembling as I pulled him back up. "Come on, Jake," I yelled, my voice breaking. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear, and we kept moving. I could see Dad up ahead, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he led the way. Mom was right behind him, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to call out to them, to tell them we needed to hide, but there was no time. The creature was getting closer. I could feel it. Its growls were louder now, so close that I could almost feel the vibrations in the ground. Finally, we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the dirt road where the car was parked. My heart leaped into my throat at the sight of it. Safety. We just had to get there. I could hear Dad shouting for us to hurry, his voice desperate. I glanced back just once, and that was enough. I saw the massive shape emerge from the darkness, its eyes glowing, its teeth bared. Dad reached the car first, fumbling with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly that for a moment, I thought he wouldn't be able to unlock it. Come on," I whispered under my breath, my feet pounding against the dirt as I ran. I could see Mom pulling at the door handle, and then, finally, I heard the beep of the locks. We all scrambled inside, the doors slamming shut just as the creature reached the edge of the road. It let out a roar that shook the car, and I saw its huge hand swipe at the air, just missing the back bumper as Dad threw the car into gear. The tires spun on the gravel for a second, and then we were moving, speeding away from the cabin and the creature that had chased us. I looked out the back window, my heart still pounding. The creature stood at the edge of the road, its eyes glowing red in the dark, watching us as we disappeared into the night. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My whole body was shaking. We'd made it. We were alive. No one spoke as we drove. The forest blurred by, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I could hear Mom sobbing softly in the front seat, and Jake was gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. But I didn't let go. I couldn't. I needed to feel that we were all still here, that we'd all made it out. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, a tiny place with a motel that looked just as old as the cabin had. Dad parked the car, and we all sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. I could still hear the creature's roar in my head, still see its glowing eyes. I knew I'd never forget it. None of us would. We checked into the motel, the lady at the front desk giving us strange looks as we stumbled in, covered in dirt and shaking, but I didn't care. All I cared about was that we were safe, for now at least. That night, as I lay in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, I could still feel the forest around me. The darkness, the feeling of being watched. It was all still there, just under the surface. I knew we'd escaped, but I also knew that whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was still in those woods, waiting. And somehow, I knew it would always be there, a part of me that I could never quite shake.